I'm going to call this session of the Boardroom Commission to order. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we are on Treaty 1 territory and it's the traditional homeland of the Métis Nation. Our panel today is made up of Ron Merritt, who's to my left. Hopefully Carrie Linkletter will soon join us and she'll be sitting immediately next to me, which she does. My name is Harvey Diamond. The city is represented by Cam Wong, and our assistant is Kelsey Harrison. We'll be hearing applications for revision of the assessment rules in accordance with the Municipal Assessment Act. The matters for which revision have been requested are described in each application, and we will limit discussion to those matters. The statements that the applicants or the assessor make at this hearing must be sworn testimony, and anyone speaking to a matter must be sworn in. Be advised, comparative assessments properties are not considered evidence by our board. Our board is appointed annually by council and is independent of it and the city administration. We make our decisions on the basis of the evidence that we hear and that alone, and we issue written orders that we mail to all parties as soon as possible. Please note that our decisions with respect to an application may be appealed to the Manitoba Municipal Board if the matter pertains to assessed value or classification, or to the Court of Queen's Bench if the matter pertains to an application for exemption from taxation. And should a party wish to appeal, information to do so will be included with our order. With respect to the hearing process, we'll confirm the matters to be addressed with each applicant following the swearing in. We will then have the assessment's testimony followed by questions, and the applicant may ask, and then we'll have the applicant's testimony followed by questions. Each party will be given an opportunity to summarize if they wish to do so. Once all the evidence of the application has been brought forward, the applicant may leave. The person will repeat for each matter on the docket today, and after all the applications have been heard, we will adjourn, deliver in private, and we'll issue written order by written mail as soon as possible. All information at our public hearings are recorded and will form part of our public record. Thank you. Let's go to the parties in.
Would you like to swear in or affirm without? Could you please state your name?
Kemal.
And do you affirm to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
Si.
Thank you.
Mark Newman.
Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Thank you.
Commissioner Wong, you can proceed on the first matter we're hearing, the 1778 Clement Highway.
Mr. Chairman, can
Yes.
I perhaps make a suggestion? There actually is an agreement on one of the properties, 99 Dalhousie,
Right.
and 505 Rouge, the last one on the docket, is what I will call a traditional apartment building.
Okay.
All the rest are not traditional apartment buildings.
Right.
They are independent living. So just on the if chance that member Linkletter is going to get here, many of the issues that will arise on all the independent livings are the same on all of them.
Okay, so on that basis, you're saying we have to receive the last one first?
Right. Well, maybe deal with Dalhousie, the settlement, then deal with Rouge, and then go to the others. And if member Linkletter gets here, and hopefully she's here before we start the independent livings.
I mean, that you don't have to reiterate things that you've already said. That makes sense, Mr. Newman.
Yeah.
So thank you for suggesting, because it's a good one on that, sir.
You're welcome.
Okay. So, Mr. Wong, I think that makes sense, and I think that we should, first of all, then deal with the housing property then, where we have an agreement, and hopefully Ms. Linkletter will be here by the time we have any things that require a real decision. So Dalhousie is item number 3 on the agenda, 99 Dalhousie,
Yes.
and we can proceed with that one, Mr. Wong, when you're ready.
Sure. The subject property is 99 Dalhousie Drive. The roll number is 030-437-80500. It's a residential apartment block. That's 3 stories high. It's built in 1972 and has 193 suites with 161 outdoor parking stalls. Sort of in reviewing this property, the model has estimated a little bit high in terms of the operating income, and I'd like to propose a revised value of, it's a total value of $21 million. The class code 20 would be $20,642,000.
Okay,
And the class code 40 is 358,000. And the adjustment was to the class code 20 portion, which was based on the NOI of 1,094,023.
great. Okay, so you've got, a net operating income?
Of 1,094,023.
Yes?
94,023.
Okay. Any questions, Mr. Ewing?
No, the revised value, as explained.
Is acceptable to you, at least, okay?
Yes.
And we haven't seen your evidence yet, but I'm assuming that then it probably takes into the fact the NOI that you had provided.
Not quite.
Something in between.
There's compromise.
Okay, we don't have to look there, but,
Yeah.
yeah. Mr. Mayor, any questions?
I have none. Thank you.
Okay, and so the cap rate stays at 5.2, obviously, then. Okay, thank you. Okay, and we'll next deal then with the last item on the agenda, which is number 8. And that is 505 Rouge Road. And Mr. Wong, when you're ready, you can proceed.
I might just have to find something first.
That's fine. Very good.
Okay, the subject property is 505 Rouge Road. The roll number is 075-531-51100. It's a residential apartment block that's 3 stories high. It was built in 1974 and has 140 units with 154 outdoor parking stalls. On page 3 is our income valuation summary. We use average rents of $982 to get a potential income of $1,651,000. We use a 2.6% vacancy to get an effective gross income of $1,608,000, and we use a 49% expense ratio to get a net operating income of $815,000. Capped at 5.3%, we have an estimated market value of $15,389,000, which is about $109,000 per unit. On page 4 are our rent comparables, showing that the rents we've used are in line with what's on the market. On the bottom of page 4 are some expense comparables, showing that the expense ratio that we've used is in line with market or supported by market. On page 5 is information on how we derived our cap rates. For the multifamily portion, our cap rates range from 4% to 7.3%, with the majority of the cap rates falling between 4.9 and 5.3%. On page 6 are some cap rate sales. The cap rates in the multifamily section, they range between 4 and 5%, but there are cap rates that are in the 6% range. And on the bottom of my page 6, there's a sale on for 500 Portage, where the cap rate was estimated to be about 4.07%. On page page 8 is a picture of the subject property at this location. Page 9 is just some information on the subject property. On page 10, 11, and 12 are the income and expenses submitted by the owner. There, on page 10, their repair and maintenance, which is in the middle of the page, is about $355,000. And on page 11, their repair and maintenance is $278,000. And then on page 12, the repair and maintenance is $428,000. So their repair and maintenance goes from, ranges from $278,000 to $428,000. I would suspect that there are some capital expenditures in there, and I actually did look at their details for 2017. They do include repairs such as $47,000 on the building exterior and $60,000 on flooring. And considering the property's 140 units, I think they are some of those expenses are capital expenditures. If you look at a more normal rate or amount for repair and maintenance, which is about $1,200 or so, their operating income is estimated to be about $850,000. That's higher than what the model is estimated at $815,000. So when you look at the actual performance of the property, maybe without some of the capital expenditure, I believe it supports the model, and I ask that you maintain the assessed value at $15,383,000.
Thank you. Mr. Neiman, any questions of this issue?
Yes. Let's look at your page 3. So this is the proposed assessment at $15,389,000. All of it, I gather, is model driven, correct?
I believe so, yes.
Okay. And when you say you believe so, the word believe catches my attention.
Sure.
Did you prepare this workup?
Yes.
Okay. All right, so page 3, everything is model driven. Let's look at page 4. So there are your comparables. Again, all selected by the model?
No, we select the comparables, and we select comparables that are similar in size and age to substantiate the rate that the model has estimated.
Okay. You receive a questionnaire response from the owner. It details the rents that are payable by the tenants in relation to the property, correct?
Yes.
All right. And your gross potential income is $1,651,000. If you jump to page 10 of your brief, that's the financial statement for the 2017 year.
Yes.
And it indicates that the total actual income was $1,574,000.
That's correct.
And that includes $2,044 of interest, correct?
Correct.
So if we took that out, we're sitting at about $1,572,000. And your effective gross income on page 3 is $1,608,000.
Correct.
Okay. So the proper comparison then, the property actually generated slightly over $1,572,000 in revenue, and after vacancy, you're showing $1,608,000.
There is the model is a mass appraisal, and so it's not going to be exact in terms of every line item.
I understand. I'm not being critical, don't misunderstand. I just want to make sure the
Sure.
board understands where the differences are.
Sure.
All right, so the effective gross income fundamentally is different by about $36,000. All right. Now, you then talked some more about the expenses, and I'll come back to that in a moment. You've also got the 2016 statement attached at page 11, and we see there that the property generated actual revenue of $1,552,000, correct?
Yes.
All right. So let's just talk for a moment about expense ratios, the bottom of page 4. In this case, you've utilized 49.29%. The expense ratios given to us at the bottom of page 4, I gather, are intended to illustrate that the 49.29% is reasonable when compared to this selection of comparables.
Yes.
Okay. And did you select these comparables for expenses, or does the model select them?
This selection was, I selected them based off of their similarity or their age and what a typical apartment might experience.
So although you've not identified the specific addresses, I gather you know which properties these are?
Yes.
And are you able to confirm that for all of these properties, the landlord pays the utilities and the tenants do not?
No.
You're not able to confirm that?
No.
Okay. But you do agree that in cases where the landlord pays the utilities, the expense ratio will be higher?
Potentially, yes.
Okay. Potentially or for sure?
It's difficult to say because
Okay.
there are situations where even though all utilities included, it might be less than another property that does experience. So that's why I say.
All right, fair enough. And if you look at page 9 of your brief, there's a photo of the property, and then there's a heading property features. There's a series of bullets. The fifth bullet down, actually the sixth bullet, it confirms that the utilities are included in the rent.
Correct.
So the landlord is paying the utilities, and therefore, generally speaking, you would expect a higher expense ratio on a property of this type, compared to properties where the landlord does
Potentially.
not pay the utilities.
Potentially.
All right. And do you have any idea in respect of these comparables, whether these are projects that have undergone a rehabilitation and therefore are able to achieve higher rents in the marketplace?
No.
Because you'd agree with me that if they can achieve higher rents, then their expense ratio will be lower.
Potentially, yes.
Okay. Now let's look at the capitalization rates. So there's a chart here. First of all, in terms of the capitalization rates that the city extracts from sales, those are driven by model-created net operating incomes, correct?
Yes.
They're not driven by the actual net operating income of the property.
No.
All right. Then, so looking at the chart, the multifamily section is the second from the bottom. there's an indication of high-rise, low-rise, low-rise A, and low-rise B. Can you explain to me, well, first of all, this property is a low-rise, correct?
Yes.
And can you explain to me the difference between simply a low-rise and a low-rise A and a low-rise B?
We don't distinguish, the rates are the same for high-rise, low-rise, low-rise A, and low-rise B.
So is the terminology a low-rise A or B a terminology that's assigned by one of the brokerage firms? In this case, CBRE?
Yes, it's just there to, because in the history, in the past, the Assessment Taxation Department has distinguished, but we found that it doesn't seem to affect the cap rate. So we have the same cap rate for all those categories. All those categories are listed. Sometimes other organizations list them in separate categories. So it's just there to help clarify.
Okay. But was there a distinction previously between an A and a B?
I don't think so. I think there was only a distinction between the high-rise and low-rise.
Okay. So the spectrum of capitalization rates, so let's just look at it for a moment. So Colliers is reporting rates of 5 to 6% for low-rise buildings. You're aware that Colliers, as part of their reporting, includes closing costs as part of the sale price?
Potentially.
You've heard that before?
I've heard it.
Okay. And the effect of that, you would agree, is to decrease the capitalization rate?
It would have an effect on the capitalization rate?
Of decreasing it?
Yes.
And then, so CBRE on low-rise buildings, and depending on whether it's an A or B, are showing rates at the low end of 5.5 and at the high end 6, and for a B at the low end 5 3/4, correct?
Yes.
And then Cushman Wakefield are showing 5 to 5 3/4 for the low rise. And the city, you're saying the 80th percentile is at 5.3%, and that's what's been selected for this property.
Yes.
And I gather all properties of this age get a 5.3%.
To my knowledge, yes.
And that's without regard to their location or condition or anything else associated with the property.
No, if it was in a very poor, we do have a poor market region that does reflect a higher cap rate.
All right.
If it was the exact same building in that market region, it would have a higher cap rate.
So location will get taken into account by the model.
Yes.
What about the condition of the property? How does the model know what the condition is?
With regards to cap rate, I don't believe it does.
Okay.
With regards to cap rate, I believe it's reflected in the income.
All right. Then let's go to page 6. So, and this is intended to provide some comfort to this panel that the capitalization rates selected by the city are reasonable, correct?
They're there to substantiate the model-derived capitalization rates.
All right. And do you know much about these 4 sales?
A little bit, yes.
Okay, so 333 Ward, for example, that's a 2006 sale, that's a pretty new property, correct?
2016, built in 2006.
Right,
2016 sale.
yes, I'm sorry, but built in 2006.
Yeah.
The other buildings are older. Do you know that each of these 3 other buildings, Roche, Talbot, and Maxwell, were bought for purposes of rehabilitation?
I believe that some had some rehab, but some smaller, some larger, yes.
Okay, and have you heard before that there's a municipal board decision that says that one needs to be careful using properties purchased for rehab as comparisons for cap rates?
I have seen decisions where they have made mention of it, but they also mention that the intention of a property owner to possibly rehab the property, it doesn't necessarily disqualify it for as a sale for capitalization rate. I think in the end, if the capitalization rate is a good estimate, results in a good estimate of value, then it is valid.
But notwithstanding these three properties where the department has calculated, I'll call it site-specific cap rates, you don't suggest that these cap rates are reflective of the market for buildings of the subject type, because even though those threes are in the 4 range, you've gone to 5.3.
There is a range, and there are properties such as this that do fall in that range, yes.
And let's just look for 1 second at your page 5. Your 20th percentile on the chart is 4.9%.
Yes.
So these three properties that are below 4.9%, they're at the extreme range of the capitalization rates, aren't they?
They are at the lower end of the range.
To the point where the department doesn't select a capitalization rate for the subject property or properties of a similar vintage based on these three sales.
These three sales are there to substantiate the accuracy of the model, and its derived cap rates. They're not meant to be specific to the subject property.
All right, thank you for that. Those are my questions, thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Merritt, any questions of the
Yes,
assessor?
Mr. Wong, I know that we've done a lot of apartment buildings, and I know there's a capitalization cutoff in regards to when they were built. And I think the subject property was built in 1974, so that's right at the borderline.
Yes.
So the swing, if it was built earlier, what capitalization rate would be applicable?
If it was built in 1975, it would be 5%.
And, okay. So the model produces a percentage-wise and for expenses and a percentage-wise for capitalization. You have the financial statements for the subject property. So I know the model spits out the resulting value. Okay, but do you, because you have the financial statements, do you try to prove the expense ratio or the expenses for the subject property?
I might not try to go, if we tried to prove every line item, it'd be long. If you look at the operating income that the property is, the estimated net operating income, it actually is higher than what the model has estimated at 15,000,
Okay,
850,000.
but when these properties are appealed,
Yeah.
you know, like you say, you don't have a chance to go through all of them, but basically if they're appealed, would you not do that sort of calculation for the property?
Yes, in this particular case, we did make a revised suggestion on the previous property, the 99 Dalhousie. With regards to the subject property, when I look at the operating income, it's difficult to use it because their repair and maintenance fluctuates so much, and it's because of the fact that there is some capital expenditure in there. So if you used a more normal amount of repair and maintenance, the operating income in this particular case, I believe it's higher than the model.
So you wouldn't know what the capital expenditures are unless you delve further?
Yeah, and in this particular case, I did look into the summary. There's a summary income statement that's provided, but Mr. Newman provided me with a more detailed income statement, and like I said, I listed off some items, which are, say, the building exterior for 47,000, and the flooring replacement, which is 60,000, and this is 104 units, so it doesn't seem like it would be a recurring expense, and so that's why when you ask me if I would consider it, yeah, I think I would consider it, and when I do consider it, it seems like the operating income is, if you use market repair and maintenance, it would be higher than what the model has estimated at $815,000.
So, when you do your page 4 in regards to expense comparisons, and you're looking at the age of the building, and you're looking at the expense ratio, and you feel as if your, the model is correct and good at the 49.29?
Yes.
And so your, I guess, the proof that you're after is according to your expense estimate for these 4 properties that are here.
Well, it's a combination of that, and if you look at their income statement.
So, I noticed that they're close, you know, they're all within reason, but it doesn't tell you the number of units in these comparisons, does it?
No. You might be able to get an idea of the size based off of the amount of the income. For instance, the model is estimated 1.6 million in income, and some of the properties are 4 million in income, 2 million in income, and 1.5 million in income. So maybe the last on Henderson would be similar in size.
All right. No, that's it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Well, Mr. Mayor asked you so many questions that I don't have very many left to ask. But one thing that Mr. Newman did allude to was the fact that his property, that they do include utilities.
Yes.
And looking at their statements, I see they have significant expenses for utilities.
Yes.
And I'm looking at your comparisons on page 4, and I note that you don't know whether utilities are included in these models at the bottom. But I see there is a fluctuation in that at 49%, you're a little bit lower than at least 2 of them,
Yep.
which are over 50.
Yep.
And would your estimate, when the model took the 49%, did they consider the fact that utilities in this instance were payable by the landlord and not the tenant?
I don't know if it considers that. It almost considers it as sort of a semi-net or semi-gross type of expense, because the model takes into consideration, it kind of lumps all the properties into one, and so it kind of includes properties that include all expenses, includes our net rents. In this particular case, it appears to be pretty close. Like when you look at their income statement, which does include their utility expenses, and then when you try to estimate their operating income using those utilities, I believe that the operating income is higher than what the model has estimated. So,
So then and I got that answer, and I guess what you're alluding to, the fact is you look at the statements, you looked at the costs of maintenance and view of the property, you've indicated that you think that that includes capital expenses that shouldn't be there. Taking that out, you say you get a higher NOI
yes.
than you've estimated in
Yeah.
valuing this property.
Yeah, and like I said, I've given some examples of some of their capital expenditures, and I believe that the model is very close.
Okay, well, we'll hear what Mr. Newman has to say about that.
Yeah.
And it's going to be his turn right now, thanks.
Oh, yes,
Okay.
absolutely.
Okay, that's my questions, thank you. So, Mr. Newman, you can go ahead, be ready.
Thank you.
I'm sorry, I thought I made that clear, but obviously I didn't.
140 units. From my perspective, a couple of issues. One, I think the gross potential income has been overstated. As I illustrated through my examination of the assessor's effective gross income is $1,608,000, so that takes into account vacancy. If you go to tab 2 of my materials, And you'll see the same financial statements the assessor has in his brief, which I took him to. Page 1 of tab 2 is the 2016 statement. And on page 4 of tab 2, you can see the rents, the actual rents in place at the top of page 4. And then page 5 is the 2017 statement, and again, it's in the assessor's brief, and that's followed by the questionnaire. And if you go to the top of page 8 of tab 2, you can see the rents in place, which create the gross potential income of $1,567,000. So, as I indicated earlier, I think one of the places we are apart is that we're about $36,000 apart on the effective gross income. The assessor's is model driven, mine is based on the actual in place, and so that's one of the differences between us. The vacancy of 2.6% is accepted. The expense ratio, it's set at 49.29%. In 2018, the expense ratio was 51.14%. This is an older building in the sense that it's 1974. It's 4 separate buildings. It's not, you'll have a large building that may have 140 units in it. This is 4 separate buildings with everything that brings with it in terms of separate mechanical systems for the building, separate boilers for the buildings, separate entrances for the buildings. You have 4 sets of everything, whereas you may have other buildings of an equivalent size where, because they're in one building, you'll have 1 set of everything. And so ultimately I'm suggesting to you that the expense ratio, and I appreciate it's model driven and I appreciate it's reflective of this type of building as a whole. I've ultimately set it back at 51%, and I'll show you that in my calculation in a moment, primarily because the building's not getting younger, it's continuing to age, and because it's 4 separate buildings, that is different than a situation where it's not. I note that at the expense comparables the assessor used at page 4 of his brief, many of them have much larger revenue than the subject does. We don't know if utilities are included or not, so I'm not sure ultimately how helpful they are. And then the other thing in terms of the condition of the building I'll mention is at tab 3, you've got a roof report from May of 2017, which speaks to the condition of the roofs on the property. It references the fact that there are the 4 buildings. If you look at the second page, well actually on the first page still, the second paragraph, you can see an indication that the original roof is still on building 2000. So this is an old roof, and of course when you spend money patching, you spend money, and eventually this roof has got to go. And this roof is, if you look at page 2 of the report down at the bottom, they're estimating $25,000 for miscellaneous repair costs, but they're also noting that there's a quantity of wet insulation, and depending on how much of that is found, that will impact on that cost. But they're also noting that the cost of replacing the roof at 2017 was estimated to be $200,000 plus the applicable taxes. So, clearly the roof on building 2000 is in a difficult state, and clearly it's going to have to need some work. Then at tab 4 of my materials, I provide you with a set of capitalization rate information. The first page, that's the capitalization rate chart that the city utilized in 2018, and you can see some circles there. The point I wanted to make simply is that the city has brought down their range of capitalization rates. So the city's 20th and 80th percentiles this time on low-rise buildings is 4.9 to 5.3. Last time, it was 5.25 to 5.5. The question will be, how come it's come down? And I'm going to speak to that in a little bit more detail in a moment. Page 2 is the present capitalization rate chart, which is part of the assessor's brief. Page 3 is the CBRE material, and on the next page of that, it's page 4 in the lower right-hand corner. You can see that for apartments, for what they're calling a low-rise A, 5.5 to 6. For what they're calling a low-rise B, 5 3/4 to 6. Remember that the department's capitalization rates are model-driven in the sense that they use model-driven NOI and are not site-specific. What follows was the CBRE capitalization rate chart for 2016. We can pass that by. Page 7 is an excerpt from some material that Altus has prepared. And I just want to, in the lower half of that page, it talks about the apartment universe. Clearly what's happened in Winnipeg over the past number of years, primarily I would suggest a function of lower interest rates, is you've seen a very large expansion of the number of units in the apartment market. And for example, in 2011, there were 52,319. In 2017, there's 57,407. This will not include the condominiums that have been built, of which there are a huge amount, many of which have leaked, I'll use the word, into the rental market. They're not all owner-occupied. So that's something to have in mind. Then on page 8, you've got some historic capitalization rate information, which I in many ways have covered already by looking at the charts. Then on page 9, this is an excerpt from the transcript of a hearing relating to an apartment building. And you'll recall that I asked the assessor earlier about Colliers and whether their capitalization rates include the closing costs as part of the sale price, and the effect of that being to actually decrease the capitalization rates. I know that Rocky Neufeld, who is with Colliers, has been quite candid in saying that from his perspective, that's a marketing tool, that it has the effect of lowering the cap rates and causes sellers to believe that they may get more for their property and therefore be more willing to sell their properties. And what this transcript excerpt explains, and this is Don White giving evidence. Don White is a broker at Colliers, and he manages the investment services group at Colliers, and his team sells apartments, and they were speaking about the fact that the capitalization rate, based on the inclusion of these closing costs, which will include CMHC fees if it's an insured mortgage, land transfer costs, lawyers' fees, all of that gets included in the closing costs, and the effect of that, as I say, is to artificially reduce the capitalization rates that Colliers reports. And the end result of all that is, whenever you look at a Colliers rate, in my view, you need to add 25 to 50 basis points to get a rate that is comparable to what the other brokers are doing. Then on page 16 and 17, what I am showing you is the interest rates at April 1 of 18 on page 16 and on April 1 of 17. And I can see that one of them is the prime rate and the other one is the bank rate, and that actually was not what I intended to do, so I made an error there. What I intended to do was to compare the same rates. So the bank rate at April 1 of 16 was 0.75%, and by April 1 of 18 it had risen to 1.5%, so it was up by 75 basis points. Prime rate was 2.7 at April 1 of 16, and at April 1 of 18 it rose to 3.45%. And the only reason I tell you that is because capitalization rates are very much a function of interest rates. And if interest rates are rising, as they were, if the market is tightening, then there is no reason for capitalization rates generally to be going down. I don't suggest there may not be a specific property where that rule may not follow, but in a general sense, capitalization rates do tend to track the marketplace. And so I tell you all of this, so now let's go to tab 5 of my material, and that's the calculation of my value. So at the end of the day, you can see that for the gross potential incomes, I've used the actual rents reported by the questionnaires. I've used a 2.6% vacancy, as did the assessor. I've used a 51% expense ratio for the reasons I've articulated, which makes my expenses $778,000. And in the result, my net operating income becomes $747,000. I'm suggesting that rather than the 5.3% capitalization rate the assessor has suggested, that for two reasons primarily. One, I think the market more generally is not at 5.3% on buildings of this type. If you look at the City of Winnipeg charts, you see that Colliers is reporting 5 to 6. And remember what I said about the closing costs, which would create a bump in the rates. CBRE is reporting 5.5 to 6, and Cushman is reporting 5 to 5.75. Considering the age of this building, and actually these buildings, because there's 4 buildings, and considering the condition of the roof, where one portion of the roof needs full replacement and another portion needs $25,000 of repairs, I think an increase to the capitalization rate proposed by the city is appropriate, and hence you're getting the value I'm proposing relative to what the assessor is proposing. Subject to questions, those are my suggestions.
Thank you, Mr. Newman. Mr. Wong, do you have any questions?
Actually, sorry.
I'm sorry?
One last thing.
Go ahead.
I have some rebuttal, and maybe I should hand it out now.
You know what, maybe, just so we'll have everything straight, unless you're gonna have more questions asked, not rebuttal, maybe we should do it after, and then we can keep things clear.
Whatever you.
Certainly you'll have an opportunity to bring in the rebuttal,
Thank you.
but, I think this is clean as we can.
Okay.
Okay? So, Mr. Wong, any questions you can ask of the assessor if you have them? I'm not assessor, the applicant you might have right now?
Yeah, I guess regarding to your tab 5 and your evaluation,
Yes.
I see you included the rent, their actual rent, to try to estimate their potential income. Why did you not include the other income that the property takes in? Because that's typically included when calculating the operating income.
Because I've always believed that the model-generated rents are driven by base rent only. So
That's not correct.
Well, that's what I believe, so to be consistent. But at the end of the day, as we discussed earlier, I think the effect would be that we talked about the actual income on the property over the 2 years being the revenue rather being $1,552,000 and $1,572,000.
Okay, so you're just not including the other income to be consistent with what you believed?
Right.
Okay. And with regards to the 51% expense ratio that you used, is that based off of actual expenses?
It was a function of a combination of the expenses, but as well the age of the building and the historic expense ratio treatment.
Okay, so it's a number that you've estimated?
Yes.
Okay, and is it based off of any sort of market information or the subject's actual expenses?
I certainly was aware of the actual expenses. I was aware of how the property was treated historically, the age of the property, and I felt that, consistent with the past, a slight increase to the model of 49.29% was appropriate.
Okay, so it's not based off of market or the subject property?
It's a combination.
I think the question has been answered, Mr.
Okay.
Newman.
I guess you had mentioned the $200,000 for repairing the roof for one of the buildings.
Yes.
So would you consider that a capital expense?
Without meaning to get overly technical, because from an income tax perspective, sometimes a capital expenditure is something that improves the property, whereas something that simply maintains the property is not a capital expenditure. This roof expense will simply maintain the property, but having said that, it's not an expense that will recur year after year. I'll say it to you that way.
Okay.
But I do believe it is an expense any buyer would take into account in some way.
So on your tab 4,
Yes?
I guess you were pointing out that the 80th percentile, the 20th and 80th percentile cap rates are 5.25 and 5.5 for the city?
For 2018,
Yeah.
yes.
And if you go to page 3 of your main presentation,
The text? Yes?
on the second paragraph, it says that all the factors that were mentioned above contribute to an increase in value of apartment buildings and a decrease in capitalization rates. Wouldn't that be, isn't that stating what the city has done in terms of decreasing the capitalization rate from 2018 to 2020?
So, and perhaps I wasn't sufficiently clear. Historically, that's what happened. But those same people noted, so if you go down 2 more paragraphs, they note that with the proliferation of newly constructed properties, the consequential increase in vacancy, the tightening up of the residential rent control rules relating to rehabilitation, that capitalization rates have moderated, and the unprecedented low rates of the 2011-15 timeframe have now increased. And that's why I pointed you to the interest rates as well.
Okay. That would be all my questions.
Thank you. Mr. Mayor, any questions of the applicant?
Mr. Newman, you're using the 5 3/4 cap rate?
Yes.
Okay. What points you sort of in that direction of the 5 3/4?
Well, it's a couple of things. It's in part, it's the age and condition of the building. It's in part, it's my belief that the decrease in capitalization rates that the city has shown at the 20th and 80th percentiles of 4.9 to 5.3 is not reflective of the marketplace. I point to it in part by Colliers, and remembering that I think their rates are a bit understated, but they're in the range of 5 to 6 for low-rise buildings. CBRE is 5.5 to 6, or 5.75 to 6, and that Cushman Wakefield are in the 5 to 5.75. The moderation of interest rates, as I've indicated, and indeed the increase in the interest rates by the Bank of Canada between April 1 of 16 and April 1 of 18. So it's the combination of all of those factors, together with the increase in supply in the marketplace, both of newly built apartments, but also condominiums that I indicated earlier are leaking into the rental market. It's all of those things that suggest to me that there is not a decrease in capitalization rates, but rather there is a moderation of capitalization rates, and therefore the decrease from the 2018 cycle wasn't warranted. And all of that in a general macro sense, and in the micro sense, now looking at this building specifically, again, it's 4 buildings, the age, the condition, so all of those things together took me there.
Thank you.
Okay, Mr. Newman, I guess a couple of things. First of all, I didn't see the, assessor asking a question on this, but one thing he did stipulate was that he thought that the expenses did include capital expenses for repair and maintenance. It shouldn't be there and shouldn't come off end of the year. And, you know, if it's NOI, can you respond to that?
Sure. So, and again, we get into a bit of a distinction between capital expenses and expenses that may not recur on an annual basis, and the roof is an example of something that won't recur every year. It's an extraordinary expense in that sense. Some property managers will track certain expenses for purposes of residential rent control, because when you expend certain monies on certain things, there's an ability to get a rent increase based on those expenditures. The reality is that the ceiling used to be rent control, and therefore you very much had to get your rents up above the guidelines. The reality today is rent control is no longer the issue. The cap is created by market control, as I call it. There's so much in the marketplace now, and landlords are having to give discounts to fill their buildings. You didn't see that 5 years ago. That world has changed. So yes, there are monies being spent, but for example, when you replace the flooring in the common areas, you've got 4 buildings, if you replace the flooring in the halls, that's a significant expenditure. I don't believe it's capital in nature in the sense that it improves the building, it just maintains the building. It's a worn out item. Buildings of this size, and again, 4 buildings, continuously there are items that are being worn out and will be replaced. Is it possible because they do more projects in 1 year as opposed to another year that those numbers may bump up a little bit? Absolutely they are. But at the end of the day, what we have done is we're not attempting to use the actual repair and maintenance expenditures. We've stayed with the model, albeit a slight bump at 51% compared to the 49.29, but we haven't tried to use the actual expenditures.
Okay. And would you agree that capitalization rates, for the most part, have a reflection sitting in the marketplace, the individual building, and I acknowledge the fact that if it needs roof repairs, that does create some risk that it's gonna probably pay a higher cap rate, so I'll acknowledge that.
Right.
But also, comparative investments also have an influence, and as a bond owner, would you, anybody who's a bond owner knows that bonds have been going up, not down in past years. There haven't been any instances of bonds going down that I've seen. They're always going up because the interest rates on bonds are compressing.
Right.
And an apartment building is like investment. It includes mortgages and also capital investments like apartment buildings have the same reflection onto an investor.
To some extent.
Yes.
All other factors being equal, I would agree with you. But when you have a significant influx of supply into the marketplace, that will change that equilibrium a little bit. And so now, it's not simply a matter of tracking bond rates per se, but now you have to look to what else is happening in the market.
Okay, and I would agree with you there.
Right.
If there was a shortage of capital, looking for places to find investments, I don't know if that's the case.
I think there's lots of capital around that
There is.
don't know what to do with their money.
Exactly, and I think that's the case, so.
Right.
And then really, the bonds are no longer an alternative because they've gotten ridiculously low, so things that real estate do look more attractive in those cases.
They do, in a general sense, and again, that's why I say to you, if you go back, what I'll call 4 to 7, 4 to 8 years, you saw the compression of rates, you saw
Right.
interest rates come down, you saw mortgage money get cheap, and you saw an explosion of construction in this city of both rental apartments and condominiums.
Okay,
But, you know, in many ways, that's the marketplace. The marketplace is always exuberant, and then it corrects.
okay, thank you very much.
Yeah.
Okay, that completes this matter then, but you have a rebuttal.
I have a brief rebuttal.
Yes, okay.
And I'm gonna hand it out now, and potentially it's of application in the other matters as well.
That's fine.
What this is this is a report prepared by Altus, which has been provided to me by Altus. And this is here really for one reason. It's to address the capitalization rate comparables, the chart of the assessor, which is found on page 6 of his report. It reflects an analysis of the 4 properties that were sold, that are listed by the assessor on page 6. And it starts with the decision of the municipal board in the Rich John case, which begins at page 4 of the materials.
Not that I want to cut you off, Mr. Newman, I can say that I think that both me, myself, and Mr. Mayor, and I think Mr. Miller also seen this before.
Okay.
But by all means,
Then I'll be,
but all means refer to it.
I'll be
And
abbreviated.
I think it's where you want to go.
Yes,
Okay,
I'll
thanks.
be abbreviated. So I'll simply say to you that there's a municipal board decision from 2018, the essence of which was that where buildings are being sold for purposes of being rehabilitated, the actual net operating income in the sale is not a reliable indication of how and why the purchaser is buying it, and therefore, their care must be taken in looking at these comparables. And then there's detail about Roach and Talbot and Maxwell in terms of the intention to renovate on each of those. And then the Ward sale, first of all, it's a much newer property, it's a 2006 property. I've actually seen 2 different bits of information. I know that Mr. Story represented this property. I know in the 2018 appeal, he brought forth evidence to indicate a 5.3 capitalization rate. Altus is suggesting a 5.13, but 2 things here. First of all, even by the assessor's position, it's a 5 cap. Secondly, it's a much newer property. So that's simply to support my submission that these capitalization rates aren't reliable in the sense of reflecting the market generally, but are more focused towards properties that are being rehabilitated.
Thank you, Mr. Newman. Any response to the rebuttal, Mr. Wong?
Yeah, I'd just like to say on page 9 of the rebuttal submission, that in the bottom portion of the second paragraph, the underlined portion says, with the 4 remaining comparable sufficient concerns were raised by the appellant on 3 of them regarding the purchaser's intention to significantly renovate or alter the structure. The appellant produced evidence from purchasers which makes the board question the use of the purchase price and the income information. But the very last part of it is, like, the board does not accept that any intention to renovate should disqualify a property sale. So I think that just goes further to support our use of the cap rate. And also, see on page 12, the owners the owner suggested that the cap rate that they use for 191 Roach is 5%. We've estimated it to be at 4.84. So I believe that the cap rates that we've presented are good estimates of market value.
Thank you. Mr. Mayor, do you
I have none, Mr. Chairman.
Sorry? Sir?
I'm sorry?
I said, do you have anything that you wish to question on this rebuttal?
No, thank you.
I don't either, thank you. Okay, I'm gonna call a short adjournment right now, just because I think it's a good time.
Yeah,
we wanna
and can I just mention, as I did earlier, the balance of the properties are all independent
Right.
livings. And what I will do is I will ask a series of questions on the first of them.
And
then
we'll
I
consider
will-
ask and answer all of the others, if that's okay?
Exactly.
Okay, we're all happy with that.
Good.
And I think panel members can do the same, unless something pretty comes up.
Sure.
Anyway, thank you.
Okay.
So we're back on, and Mr. Wong will next deal with item number 1 that's on the agenda, which is the 99 Dalhousie Drive property. And you proceed when you're ready.
You said 99.
No, we're
Oh.
gonna go to about 1778 Pembina Highway.
Did I take the wrong one here?
We,
Oh, I see what you-
Dalhousie was a recommendation.
That was the recommendation,
Just
okay, I'm
accept it.
sorry, you're right. I put it aside, and I picked the wrong pile.
There's lots of files this morning.
I know, unfortunately, because we had it out before. Okay,
Yes.
right. So 1778 Pembina Highway, and when you're ready, you can proceed.
Okay. The subject property is 1778 Pembina Highway. The roll number is 030-800-220-00. It's a residential apartment block that's 4 to 8 stories high. It was built in 2008 and has 215 suites with 30 outdoor parking stalls. On page 3 is our income valuation summary. We use average rents of $819 for the class code 20 portion to get a potential income of $1,365,000. We used a 2.4% vacancy to get an effective gross income of $1,332,000. And we used a 43% expense ratio to get a net operating income of $757,000. Kept at 5%, we have an estimated market value of $15,150,000 for the class code 20 and $8,309,000 for the class code 40S. On page 4 are our rent comparables, showing that the rents we used are lower than average compared to market in the marketplace. On the bottom of page 4 are some expense comparables, showing that the expenses that we've used are a little bit higher than what is in the marketplace for a newer 2008 building. On page 5 is information on how we derived our cap rates. Page 6 are some cap rate sales. Just on the top of page 6 is the following is an example of actual sales that took place during the reference period. The purpose for showing these individual capitalization rates is to illustrate the accuracy of the model and to substantiate the model-derived capitalization rates. They are not meant to be comparable specific to the subject property. The net operating income has been developed through stabilizing owner-reported income and expense information. Capitalization rates have been derived by dividing the property's net operating income by its sale price. These cap rates aren't meant to be directly comparable or specific to the subject property, but the 333 ward is probably the most similar in terms of it being a newer building, and we have it at 5%, which is what the model is estimated for this property. And also on the bottom of page 6 is 500 Portage with an estimated cap rate of 4.07%, which supports the 5% that the model is utilized for the subject property. On page 8 is a picture of the subject property with its location. On page 9 is some information on the subject property, and that it is an assisted living property as well as an independent living property. So the fact that it is an assisted living property and an independent living property is why we're valuing it as an apartment building. So we have market information to try to establish a value, whereas we don't have market information to try to establish a value as an independent living property. If you go to page 13. The subject property is comprised of bachelors, 1 bedrooms, and 2 bedrooms. On page 13 are the market rents from CMHC indicating bachelors for newer buildings to be $725, and 1 bedrooms $11.91, and 2 bedrooms are $13.92. We've utilized a rate of $819, which is lower than average compared to market. Page 14 and 15 are the permits that were taken out for the subject property in 2006. They had construction values of $14 million and for 1 building, and then $5.6 million for another building. It's about 19 million six in terms of declared construction value. That was in 2006, 12 years prior to the reference period. The market has changed substantially since then, so I believe that the market has doubled and potentially tripled or even more than that in that time frame. And so I believe that the declared construction values support the assessed value of $23,460,000. Yeah, so we've tried to value this as a market value apartment building, but not only as a market value apartment building. But the rents we've used are on the lower end of the range in terms of market. The expenses that we've used are a little bit higher than what a newer building might experience, and so we've treated it as if it was a lower than average apartment building. So the rents and the expenses that we use are supported by market. The cap rate is supported by market, and I believe the permanent values support the assessed value. And I ask that you maintain the assessed value at $23,460,000.
Thank you. Mr. Newman, any questions on the assessment?
Yes, and as I said earlier, I will ask an extensive set of questions on this one, and I won't ask them again.
I will remember that they were asked, and accordingly, that's fine.
So let me start with, did you inspect the subject property?
No.
Did you inspect any of the other ones that are to come?
I can't say for sure. I have looked at a few of them. I don't remember if it was any of these.
Okay, and when you say a few of them, do you mean independent livings or these ones specifically?
Independent livings.
Okay. You've said in your evidence that you value it as an apartment building because there's no information available to value it as independent living, correct?
Yes.
And so that we're clear, what goes on in these properties, both the subject and the other ones to be heard, is the operation of a business of providing a package of services to older people.
They do. Yes.
And those package of services will include meals, various activities, security, health care, a whole package of services. And for that, significant amounts are charged each month, but of course, ultimately, you can only value the real estate. So the methodology that's developed is to look to the marketplace for rents and apply market variables and essentially treat it as if it were an apartment building.
Yes.
But of course, it's not an apartment building, is it?
No.
Okay. And in this one, and we'll talk about it in more detail in a moment, you've actually got two parts of the property. One which is the independent living, and the other which is supportive living.
Correct.
Okay. And is it fair to say that the market or the rents, are they derived by the model? So if we look at your page 4, for example, you're saying there's an average rent per unit for the subject of $956. Is the market deriving that?
Is it 819?
I think I see 956.
I think it looks at 956 on page 4 for the subject.
Now maybe that's wrong. Because you're right, on page 3 it says 819.
You know, I'm actually not too sure about that. In terms of just one second. believe the 819 is correct. I'm not sure why the other,
Okay.
yeah,
So, and the 819, just so we're clear, that's what I'll call the blended average for both buildings.
yes.
Okay. So, but let me come back to my original question. Accepting for the moment that the 956 is now not a correct number, are the comparables derived from the market?
Yes,
And would you agree with me that none of the comparables are independent living properties?
yes.
Okay. And the vacancy rates for the subject and for the others to come, they're all market-derived vacancies
Yes, as if it was an apartment, yes,
based on the model.
yes.
And the model will factor in what the age and the location in determining the vacancy?
I believe it would be both, yes.
Yes. On page 13 of your brief, you've got the CMHC stats for vacancy rates by year of construction and by type of property. You would agree with me that the CMHC stats do not include independent living?
I'm not sure, but I'm not sure. I would think that they include apartment buildings, standard apartment buildings.
Right. And the expense ratios you've used in all of these, they're not site-specific, they're model-driven based on the age of the apartment buildings?
Yes,
And in a general sense, what the model does is the newer the building, the lesser the expense ratio percentage will be,
that's what I've seen, yes.
in a general sense. And then if we look at page 4 of your brief, you've got a list of expense comparables. Do we agree that none of them are independent livings?
Yes,
And do we agree that you do not know whether utilities are included or not included in these expense ratios?
I do not know.
Do we agree that the utilities in the subject property and in all the others to come are included in the monthly amounts paid by the occupants?
Sorry, say that again?
Do we agree that the utilities are part of what the occupants pay each month? In other words, they're not separately billed to the tenants and paid for by those tenants in the subject property.
I am not sure.
The capitalization rate chart that you provided on page 5 for multifamily, that is all traditional apartments. None of them are independent livings.
Correct.
Similarly, the chart on page 6 of multifamily sales, none of them are independent livings.
Correct.
And 500 Portage that you made reference to, that property is both a commercial property and a residential component.
Correct.
There's like a 5 or 6 story office building fronting onto Portage,
It's about 20% commercial.
20% commercial, okay. But again, no part of it is independent living.
Correct.
And people who buy independent living facilities, they're buying them to carry on a business, which is the provision of that package of services I talked about at the outset of my questioning to their occupants, correct?
I couldn't say. I actually don't know anybody that's purchased one, and I actually don't even know if one has, I'm not aware of any sales, so I can't even go there.
But do you agree in concept that if somebody's buying the subject property,
You know, I don't know if he's capable of answering, I think certainly questionable that you can certainly argue that, and, you know, I'm not saying this makes sense.
Yeah.
But I don't know what Mr. Wong's giving back.
I just like to sort of say that,
That's
like,
fine. It's okay.
the questions that you're asking with regards to it being an assisted living, like, you know, I tried to look at it as an apartment.
No, that's fine, Mr. Newman's asking something that's very arguable,
Yeah,
but I don't know if you're capable of answering it, so that's fine.
well, yeah, I'm definitely not capable of answering the last one.
Okay. Can I ask you this question? All of these sales that are used to derive expense ratios and derive capitalization rates and to derive the comparables, are they all apartment units with kitchens?
I can't say for sure, but I would think so.
Even a bachelor has a galley type of kitchen of some kind, doesn't it?
Typically,
Okay. You know if the bachelor units in the subject have any kitchen facilities in each of the rooms?
I'm not sure.
Okay. Okay, I think those are my questions.
Thank you, Mr. Newman. You're welcome. Mr. Merritt, do you have any questions?
Just a couple. I guess Mr. Wong, the subject property, I guess, is composed of, say, 50-50, roughly,
Mhm.
roughly. And some is independent living and the other is assisted living. So when you go to evaluate, what sort of rule of thumb would you have between, you know, the assisted living and independent living? You know, do you have a dollar value? And what is that? Maybe do it on a monthly basis. What would be the difference?
I actually don't believe we distinguish. I believe that we look at, say, if there's two buildings and one was independent living and one was assisted living, we take the whole space. We don't separate them and try to value them separately. We look at the whole in terms of how much total gross floor area there is, and then we compare it to other apartment buildings. We don't distinguish. We just look at the total area of the building and what might be a comparable rent for that building. As far as I know, we don't distinguish.
You don't distinguish?
We just look at it as a whole.
As a whole, as it being an apartment building.
Yes.
So what about when they submit their worksheets? I mean, you know, you're digging up data for the subject property.
Yeah.
Don't you separate them at that point?
If you look at their income and expenses, it's actually they don't separate what part of their income is for residential and what part is for, say, services or care. So it's difficult for us to do it. But
So the departments make the distinction in regards to these, you know, properties.
Mhm.
They're valued on a per unit basis.
they're valued as if it were a apartment building. And
Yeah. Well, isn't that wrong?
Wrong.
Wrong, because there's other income there.
Like, in terms of the way that we looked at it, the rents that we've applied, they're just for an apartment. Like, there are many things, many items that are associated with independent and assisted living properties.
Okay.
If you wanted to
So,
try
okay,
to,
that's-
go
that's-
through all
that's-
that, it'd be
yeah.
a pretty
Okay.
difficult task to go through it and
So-
adjust.
Yes, so when we look at this in regards to the evaluation, they're per a unit basis only rental.
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
The income that
No-
we've used
No
is,
distinction per se for assisted living.
no. We treat it as an apartment building, and in this particular case,
Okay, that's hard to evaluate.
The thing is, the approach that we've used is based
I-
off
I-
of,
I-
it's based off
you
of
don't have
market.
to, you don't have to
Yeah.
explain the approach.
Yeah.
I see the approach, okay.
Yeah.
I don't have any further questions, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, Ms. Levin, any questions?
My questions have been asked and answered, thank you.
Okay, so I'm gonna just further, so there's basically in this building, you have assisted living and you have independent living.
Yeah.
Independent living would be somebody who just lives in a building that they do their own kitchen work, they don't have any extra facilities, they're really basically just renting, correct?
Yeah.
They don't go to a kitchen where they can have meals made for them?
Well, I
Or
think
do
is
they?
that I think they have the option. So in some properties that I've looked at,
Okay.
they have the option to just straight up just live in it as an apartment,
Right.
or they can actually pay additional.
And you know, in this instance, certainly though, the people who have the option would have to have full kitchens. Because if they're gonna cook their own food, they have to be able to do so, correct? Because Mr. Newman had asked you if you knew if all these facilities had full kitchens, and you didn't know the answer because you haven't inspected it, so you don't know, but Mr. Newman will tell us, I'm sure.
Yes, you will.
Yeah. Okay, so you're saying that you don't know, that it depends on the business aspect, you're only valuing it as a business, but what I'm saying to you is that a unit like that can be rented as an apartment because it's capable of being one, correct? But if you have units that don't have full kitchens, they're
Yeah.
not.
Yep.
And with that, certainly those people might pay more because they're getting other services, but
Yeah.
it would not be taxable, property tax assessable because it's business income, not real estate,
Yeah,
correct?
yeah, yeah.
So how do we value all these properties the same way if some of them might not have full kitchens, they might maybe have a microwave and nothing else?
Yeah, no, I understand,
Yeah.
I understand what you're talking about. If you were to sort of take bits and pieces of using the small units, the no kitchen is characteristics of an assisted living property. When we use apartment comparables, we're using apartment comparables that are just related to apartments. So if you're considering the negative aspects of not having a kitchen, then you also have to consider the positive aspects of additional income for common areas.
That's true, but some of this additional income is because they're providing a service that is not taxable as real estate.
Yeah.
You know, maybe,
It basically, we're trying to,
see, I'll tell you where I'm trying to go. I'm trying to see, if we're valued this way,
yeah,
is it sellable? Like,
Yeah.
certainly if it has a kitchen, somebody
Yeah.
who doesn't want to operate a business like this can still operate as an apartment building.
yeah. I
If
think,
it doesn't have a kitchen,
yeah,
then it's not capable of being operated that way,
yeah,
and
yeah.
it just seems very difficult to evaluate by looking at other apartment buildings that do have that facility.
Yeah, trying to sell it as an apartment building is kind of like is a theory. It probably wouldn't happen. And the way that when we're comparing it to other apartment buildings, it's almost like we're taking an apartment building that's this is the assisted living is yay big, and the units are small, but it has common areas. But we're comparing it to an apartment building that is yay big and just based off of the size and construction, and not necessarily the utility of like a smaller.
Okay, but in some ways, part of this unit lease is more like a personal care home than an apartment building. Then, if you have common areas where, people are entertained and spend their days,
Yeah.
it's almost more like a personal care home than an apartment building.
Yeah, we've looked at it as, I guess, not a standard apartment building, but something that is lower than average in that regard.
Okay.
But like I said, we're trying to compare it to something, construction, like say the construction, the age, and well, it's almost like we're theoretically trying to value it just based off of the size.
Okay. So I get the assessments department,
Yeah.
Position on it now,
Yeah.
and we're interested in hearing Mr. Newman's. I'm sure we will. So,
Yeah.
yeah, Mr. Newman, you can tell us your position now.
So, I'm gonna tell you a little bit of history. Because when these properties first came into the market, and they came into the market, and it's like everything, entrepreneurs identify a need, they come into the market to satisfy that need, and suddenly, commencing in about 2005, you had a company called All Seniors based in Toronto who decided they were going to build 5 or 6 of these in the city. They've got one in Brandon, they operate across Canada. They have a very different business model in the sense that, and this is why I asked the question about the kitchens. The All Seniors properties, and to be clear, All Seniors manages 1778 Fort Garry, but they're not the owner of it. All the other ones on the docket today are owned by All Seniors. The All Seniors business model does not see a kitchen in the units. The residents take their meals in a dining room. There is a microwave in the unit. There is a smaller size fridge. The units generally, all of the units in all of the buildings are characterized by what I will call larger common areas, bigger hallways, railings in the hallways. They are characterized by, and I've inspected every single one of these properties to be clear, they're characterized by, within the units themselves, larger areas, larger common areas, a larger hallway, for example, for those who may have mobility issues. The bathrooms are quite large, again, to accommodate those who may have mobility issues. At the end of the day, what is sold in these premises is security and lifestyle and a package of services. And Mr. Diamond, I think you, through your questions, clearly you understand the concept that although the department is treating them as if they were a typical apartment, they're not. They're purpose-built, and 1778 Pembina has the additional wrinkle, if I can call it that, of the supportive living aspect, which I'm going to talk about in more detail in a moment, because fundamentally it's a dormitory. It's a dormitory, it's not even individual apartments. But I'll come back to that. But from an overview perspective, the issue is that the department treats them as apartments. There are a number of cases that went to the municipal board on these types of properties going back probably almost 10 years already. Because the problem was, how do you figure out what the revenue should be? As you properly identified, you can't charge as part of the assessment all the revenue associated with the other services. So in the early days, there was a very convoluted process of trying to back out those other services. Eventually, and there's an article in my material that speaks to this, eventually the department came around to the view, we're not going to try and do that, that's too messy. What we're going to do is we're going to try and find proxy apartment buildings and use the rent from those proxy apartment buildings as if they were the rents that could be generated by the units in these buildings. And actually, for the first time, on the majority of the properties we're going to deal with here this morning, I've not challenged the rents. I am challenging the rents on 1778, and I'll explain why, but in a general sense, I'm not challenging the rents they're using on these other buildings because they've been way more reasonable than they used to be. And the problem is, they go to the marketplace, you see the assessor's chart with his list of comps, and these are newer buildings, they extract the rents from there, but how do you then adjust for the absence of a kitchen? How do you then adjust for some of these other things? But generally, we don't need to do that for the properties that are before you this morning. On the expense ratios, I will tell you that what I have done is I've isolated, and you will see a chart in each property, a spreadsheet. I've isolated the expenses that I consider to be attributable to real estate, and I've used those expenses to arrive at an expense ratio and compared it to the assessor's expense ratio. And so that there's no issues, generally speaking, I've used the assessor's revenue for purposes of that extracting that ratio. On capitalization rate, the conclusion I come to is you can't treat these as typical apartment buildings. The 5% capitalization rates being applied are a function of the age of the buildings. That's what the model says. Newer buildings get a 5% rate. You asked in the earlier hearing, Mr. Merritt, where's the cutoff? The cutoff is 1975. Everything post 1975 gets a 5. That's a pretty big range, but be that as it may, these aren't like those buildings. These buildings have got separate issues. So I wanted to say all of that to you by way of overview. And my thought is that I will, at the end of the day, make one closing submission to cover everything. And that's how I'm gonna do it. So having said all of that, I now want to turn to this property specifically. And what I want to do is I want to turn the pages of my tabs first. So tab 1 is the detail for what's called the landing. The landing is the independent living facility. It's the, forgive me, I'm through the magic, buying myself some more parking. So, and it's the facility that consists of the 99 one-bedrooms and 20 two-bedroom units. That tab 2 is about what's called Harmony Court. Harmony Court is the supportive living. So let me talk about that for a little bit. What you have are essentially 8 dormitories, I'm going to call them, consisting of 12 units each. These units, if you look at page 2 of the text of my brief, of the text, these are the square footages of the different types of units. Now, let's try and imagine what's 250 square feet. Is this room 250 square feet? I think it might actually be bigger, would be my guess. So that's the size of these dormitory units. What do they have in them? They have a bathroom, they have a bed, they have a TV, that's what they have. This is a program supported by Winnipeg Regional Health. You have to go through an assessment to get into this program. That's why there's a school tax exemption on this aspect of the property. And the question ultimately that I'm going to put to you is, if you're an investor and you're buying, what are you buying here? You're not buying an apartment building. You're not buying a bachelor unit that the assessor says will generate $650 a month in rent. Because even bachelor units have a galley form of kitchen. And I'm going to say to you, they're not 250 to 300 square feet. They're larger, maybe not by a ton, but they're larger. So as an investor, when I come along to buy these dormitories, I'm not buying a traditional apartment building. So don't tell me I should have a traditional cap rate. Don't tell me I should have a traditional expense ratio, because what I'm buying is very different. And you know, what we're doing here, it's in many ways it's a fictional process. I get it. I'm not being critical of the department. It's the way you deal with properties of this type. But I think things have to be recognized in terms of how you deal with them. So, in 2018, the assessor used a rent of $600 a month for the dormitories. In 2020, they're using a rent of $650 a unit for the dormitories. I do tell you about rent control and what the rent control approved increases would be, and how the increase from 2018 to 2020 exceeds the permitted rent control increases. But look, that's a fiction as well. That's just trying to compare it to a traditional apartment building. So let's come back to the tabs. Tab number 3 was actually the brief from the prior assessment appeal, only to show you what the rents were and that type of thing. Tab 4 is the calculation of the value for the present assessment. You can see my handwriting on the independent living. It's $956 a month. I think that's where the $956 came from that we saw on that sheet earlier that we wondered about.
That would make sense.
Yeah, and then on the supportive living, assisted living, there's the $650 a month. If we go to tab 5, there's an article here, and this is the article that explains the difficulty in valuing these types of properties, and one of the ways to do it is to go to the market and look for proxy rents and try and extract the beginnings of a process in that way. But again, we have to remember that the question ultimately is, how will the market treat this type of property from the perspective of capitalization rate? Tab 6 is the rent control amounts for 2017, and you can see that 2016 was 1.1%, 2017 was 1.5%. Here, the rent has gone up by $50 a month on the supportive living, and the end result of that is over an 8% increase. Tab 7 is my extraction of the expenses that I believe would be in particular related to the real estate. And you can see the listing there. It's got nothing to do with meals, it's got nothing to do with the supply of services. It's purely what I consider to be property-related expenses. You see what the amounts come to over those 2 years. And if I use the effective gross income, which I ultimately utilize as part of my calculation, and it's the assessor's effective gross income as well, then I take 5% of that to extract the management fee, and it comes to 56.73%. And that comes to $750 a door for the 215 units. In other words, it's pretty low. Tab 8 is the capitalization rate information. It's the same information that you saw when we dealt with Rouge Road. Again, I know that the department's view is that because of the age of this building, it gets a 5% capitalization rate, as all of them do. And I will expand on why you can't give this one 5%. And I will say to you, some of you may have heard me on this type of property before. Mr. Merritt, for sure, I know you have. There is a long history of the panels of this board not accepting a 5% capitalization rate in terms of how to value these properties. So I just want to circle back to one specific item, and then I'll take you to my value conclusions. So let's go into the text, please, of my brief at the beginning. So if we go to page 5, here's where I talk about the rents. So the independent living section, I tell you that in 2018, the assessor's average rent was $866. We accepted it. We did not challenge it. I tell you that rental increases are subject to rent control. There's the information for 16 and 17. So a total of 2.6% over the 2 years. If you apply 2.6 to the $866, that would be $22.51, which would get you to $888.51 on average, compared to the $956 being used by the assessor. I have conservatively fixed the rent at $900 per unit per month on average. I just want to draw to your attention something in the assessor's brief on page 4. So the assessors assigned a $956 average rent for the units in the independent living. We've now clarified. You see the comparables the assessor has used. The average rent per month is extracted from those comparables by taking all of the units and blending together their average rent. But note the proportion of 1 and 2 bedroom units between the subject and the comparables. The subject has effectively about 16-17% 2 bedroom units. 70 South Park is almost a 50-50 split. 800 Cordon is just below a 50-50 split. 1032 Wilkes is better than 2-to-1 with 2 bedrooms. And 2331 is about 20% 2 bedrooms. The reason I'm telling you this is because you get higher rent for 2 bedrooms, of course. And if you have more 2 bedrooms in a complex, then your average rent per unit is going to be skewed by that number of 2-bedroom units. So that's the only reason I'm telling you this. So I've ultimately selected $900 per month compared to the assessor's $956 for the independent living. Then at page 6 of my materials, I address the issue of what I call the dormitory, the 96 units. You've heard me a fair bit on that. In 2018, it was $600. A $50 increase is an 8.33%, well beyond. Most bachelor units, in my experience, have at least a form of galley kitchen. These do not. These have no kitchens whatsoever. They are essentially these small rooms, and to be fair, there is a common area, there is a common kitchen in each of these units, but I say to you simply, as an investor buying it, I'm not buying a traditional apartment building. I'm buying a different type of business operation, a building to be used in a different type of business operation. Page 7, I deal with vacancy. 2018, it was 5%. 2020, it's been reduced to 2.4%. There's a lot of units in the marketplace. Independent livings turn over a lot, and there's been a lot of them built in the last little while. They turn over because, unfortunately, a lot of the residents are elderly, and frequently they go to hospital, and frequently they pass on, and so there's a fair bit of turnover. I've used 4%. The expenses, 43.15% the assessor's using, and the assessor is using that on every single one of these properties. And again, I think it's purely a function of the age of the buildings. The newer buildings get the lower expense ratio. You saw my workup at tab 7, where I worked through all the expenses. They came to 56.73% of the effective gross income. I'm using 45%. I'm being conservative. I'm using 45%. I think the assessor's 43.15 is too low. Capitalization rates, I tell you a long story about capitalization rates, and I tell you simply everything you've got in all the charts and all the market data, it's all about traditional apartment buildings. This is not. There's a much different level of risk for somebody who buys a property of this type because they can only use it as part of a going concern. So at the end of the day, now we can go to tab 9, and we can work through the calculation. So what I've done is I valued them separately. I valued the 2 income streams separately. So on the bachelors, I've used $500 a month, 4% vacancy, the 45% ratio, and a 5.75% capitalization rate, which results in a value of $5,289,000. And on the independent living, I've used an average rate of $900 per unit per month for the reasons I described earlier, the 4% vacancy, the 45%, and the 5.75%, and that results in the value of $11,368,000. And subject to questions, those are my submissions.
Mr. Wong, any questions of the applicant?
Yeah. It's for your page 5 on your main part, on your main brief.
Yes.
You've used $900 per unit on average.
Yes.
Is that based off of market comparables or actual rents?
No, it's taking the 866, which the assessor used in 2018.
No, that's fine. You've answered my question. Thank you.
You're welcome.
I guess the same thing for page 6, the $500 that you used. Is that based off of actual or market?
It's based on, in part on a comparison of market, because the CMHC, which is part of your material, reports bachelors at a certain level,
$725.
yes, for 2005 plus construction. But of course, those units will be bigger and will have something of a kitchen, these don't, so it's a combination of those factors.
And on your page 8, you've used a 45% expense ratio. Is that based off of the actuals or market comparables?
It's based off the actuals in this property, but of course, as I was doing this, I was doing all the other ones that are on the docket. And generally, you're gonna see the same kind of higher expense ratios than the city is allowing.
So it's not based off of a market or actuals?
Well, it's based on a market of these types of buildings, because I was doing all the other ones at the same time.
If you go to your tab 5,
Yes?
I'm not sure what page, it looks like it might be page 277,
So the second last page,
second last page.
okay?
So on the last paragraph on the left-hand side, it says, in order to eliminate the intangible business value from the analysis evaluating the rent, expenses, and cash flow of a comparable apartment building may provide insight into the actual real estate value. Typically, a comparable apartment building in terms of size, construction, and condition is appropriate for estimating the economic rent. Would you agree with that statement?
In a very general sense, yes, but then you have to look site-specific to what's on your property to
Okay.
see if it's comparable to the spectrum of the market, of the apartments. It's the kitchen issue.
Oh, no, I believe it says in order to eliminate the intangible business value from the analysis, you should look to market. Okay.
No, but just wait a minute, it's not just a matter of eliminating the intangible business value, that's how you get rid of the services. That's why you use apartment rents as a proxy. But even when you're using apartment rents, you have to make sure you're comparing apples and apples in the sense of the physical facility. And if it doesn't have a kitchen, then you're not comparing apples and apples.
Well, does it mention anything about comparing apples to apples besides using a comparable building in terms of size,
Yeah.
construction, and condition?
I think, well, don't you think the word comparable means comparable apartment units? Or just
no.
the building envelope?
I believe it says comparable apartment building. How many apartment buildings are the same as an assisted living? I would say none.
Right.
And so I think it's assumed that it's a standard apartment building.
Sure. I don't want to debate semantics with you
Well,
overly.
Doesn't matter.
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
good.
And on the second paragraph, on the right column, assuming that the economic rent for the apartment provides a reasonable basis for a facility's revenue, the expenses from comparable apartment building or industry averages for similar apartment buildings are also applicable. Would you agree with that?
In a general sense, yes, but the key
Okay.
word is comparable.
Okay. That would be all my questions.
Thank you. Mr. Nicola, any questions of the applicant?
No questions.
Mr. Merritt, any questions?
Yes, Mr. Newman, I can see that there's quite a difference in regards to evaluating this property, because like you say, there's 96 units there that are ranging between 264 square feet to 320. So very hard to, so you envision like a room which is like 16 by 20, and it's very small. So Like I say, hard to equate to the evaluation of a unit like this, or units like this that consist of 96 units. Was the previous assessment, where is it at? Is that at the municipal board?
It's sitting at the municipal board.
Okay, at the municipal board.
I mean, there was a reduction granted from the prior proposed value. And I mightn't be able to tell you what it is, but I can also tell you it's sitting at the municipal board right now, awaiting
Maybe,
further hearing.
maybe that would help. I did look at it, and in total, it was 20,916.
Yeah, so I've got it here, actually.
So what was the?
A panel comprised of Messrs. Mitchelson, Boreski, and Buss, in their wisdom, determined that they would use the assessor's NOI and a capitalization rate of 5.5% and put the value at $19,015,000 overall.
19,015,000?
Yes.
All right. I don't have any other questions, Mr. Chairman.
I just want to make sure, clarify one thing, and I'm looking at your tab number 7,
Yes.
where you have your expenses.
Yep.
Are all those expenses the actual expenses for the whole property, or have you, so you haven't apportioned anything out for the business portion?
No, so the following pages
Mhm.
are the questionnaires. So if you look at page 2 of that tab, you can see the circle, that's my big circle.
Right.
It's around those expenses, and what I did is I took out of there the expenses that I considered relevant, but did not deal with food, for example, or food salaries, but that's where I got them from.
But fair enough, it could be argued though that part of the insurance would also aspect the non-assessed values that are, as the other things too.
Sure.
I mean, some clearly go right to, like cable, I suppose, if everybody has them in their own units, and there aren't any others, but some of them would be, have to be apportioned.
Well, I mean, you know, again, waste and snow.
I don't know how much, unfortunately, and I don't think you do either.
I don't,
You know.
but again, when I eyeball them, so you mentioned insurance, for example.
Yeah.
$32,000.
Yeah, professional.
Okay, professional,
Interesting, one year they have nothing, and the other year they have a significant amount.
yep,
Must have been an assessment year.
all kidding aside, that's exactly what it was.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's exactly what it was.
Okay, thank you. Okay. So that's the questions, and you have the same rebuttal, I'm sure, on all of them.
I have the same rebuttal, yes, and again, I think that point is made even simpler because clearly, there have been no sales of independent livings.
Okay.
So there's nothing to look to from that perspective.
Okay, thank you.
Okay?
Okay, you know what, we're gonna have to adjourn for a few minutes.
Yeah.
Because one of our members has to feed a meter.
Yeah.
Okay, our next property is 901 Shaftesbury Boulevard. Mr. Wong, when you're ready, you can proceed.
The subject property is 901 Shaftesbury Boulevard. The roll number is 100-064-211-00. It's a residential apartment block that's 2 to 3 stories high. It was built in 1972 to 2008. It has 189 units with 3 indoor parking stalls and 90 outdoor parking stalls. On page 3 is our income valuation summary. For the class code 20, we used a rent of $922 for actually both class codes to get a potential of $2,077,000 for the class code 20. We get 2.4% vacancy to get an effective gross income of $2,027,000. It was a 43% expense ratio to get a net operating income of $1,152,000. Capped at 5%, we have an estimated market value of $23,057,000, which is $122,000 per unit. On page 4 are our rent comparables. showing that the rents we've used are in line with what's on the market or supported by the market. On the bottom of page 4 are some expense comparables showing that the expenses that we've used are in line with what's on the market, supported by the market. On page 5 is information on how we derived our cap rates. On page 6 are some cap rate sales. Once again, 333 Ward probably being the most comparable. Page 8 is a picture of the subject property with its location. On page 9 is some information on the property, some independent living, assisted living property. Page 9, or 10 and 11 are the income and expenses submitted by the owner. On page 13 are the CMHC market rents for newer buildings. Bachelors being $725, one bedrooms being $11.91, and two bedrooms being $13.92. The model utilized rate of $922 is below average. Page 14 is the permit that was taken out in 2016. Declared project value of $15 million. Again, the model rents that we've used, they're lower than average, and the expenses that the model has utilized is higher than average. The cap rate that we've used is supported by the market, and the permit, the construction costs support the model, and I ask that you maintain the assessed value of $23,192,000.
Thank you. Mr. Newman, any questions listed with the property that you didn't ask before?
Yeah, just a couple. Page 3. Again, you're indicating the average rent per unit is $922.49.
Yes.
There are 19 bachelors in this property. Are you able to tell me what rent is being utilized for the bachelor units?
No, it's a blended rent.
And did the model extract the blend?
Yeah.
Okay. And then if we look at page 4, and I think maybe we have the same issue as on the last one, if you look at the subject property column, the average monthly rent is stated to be $1,202, which I don't think is right. I think that so the 1202 is is for the class code 10T. That's what it is.
Yep, that's correct.
Yeah, okay. So again, as with the last one, none of your expense comparables are independent livings, correct?
Correct.
And looking at page 4, again, the proportion of 2 bedrooms to 1 bedrooms, all of the comparables have a higher proportion of 2 bedrooms than in relation to the subject, correct?
Yes.
Okay. You've not been in this property, correct?
No.
Those are my questions.
Thank you. Mr. Mayor, any questions of the?
So on the dates, et cetera, for the building, and I would say some sort of renovations. So you've used the 5.3 cap rate?
5.
Okay, you used 3.2 and then 5 on the other.
5.3 on the 10T.
That's the house. It's they're different buildings. The assisted independent living was built in 2008.
Okay,
And the other one,
Okay.
the house was built in 1972. So the class code 10 is that house. If you look on my page 8, on the top of the property, there's a house. Whereas the class code 20 is the large building below the house.
all right, thank you.
Are there any questions?
Yes. So the 1972 is referring on your page 1 of your brief under actual year, that is the house?
I believe so, yes.
Okay. And you said you did not visit this property?
No.
So is the house being rented?
We have it as one unit.
Okay. Do you know if it's being utilized at all?
I do not know.
Okay. Are you aware that this property also has an institutional portion to it?
It does not.
It's got 24-hour care?
It does not. We have it as a class code 20, 20T and a 10T.
Okay. But you did not visit this property?
No.
Okay, thank you, that's all my questions.
Okay, Mr. Wong, I'm referring to your page number 4, and you have the subject property, you're doing rent comparisons. So you have this, the 880 is the square footage. Is that the average of all the units, or is that particularly?
It's gross floor area. It's not the actual size of the units. It's the gross floor area. It's
Divided
not-
by number of units?
Yes, yes.
So,
It includes like hallways or.
okay, and also, so the bachelor units could be much smaller than 880 then?
Oh yeah. Well, the thing is that's just an average based off of the gross floor area of the
Okay,
building.
you answered that question, thank you.
Yeah.
Sorry, can I just redirect what you say?
You have another question?
I
Okay, okay, Ms. Linkler has another question to ask you.
Sorry, page 14 of your brief, you've got the permit detail,
Yeah.
and that's at a cost of 15 million?
Yes.
Okay. Do you know what specifically that pertains to?
Just it is the total project value declared on the permit.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
No.
Okay, and I don't have any others either, thank you. Mr. Neiman?
So, on this one, so let's go to the text of the brief at the beginning. So you can see some discussion about the size of the units. In the second paragraph, the average size of the bachelor units is approximately 350 square feet. The one bedrooms are approximately 600, but range from 503 to 721, of which there are 2. And the 2 bedrooms are approximately 865 square feet, and again, there's a range. No stoves, no dishwashers, no full kitchens in these units. Member Linkletter, you asked about 24-hour care. There is a section of the building that is, I'll call it secure, in the sense that it's intended to deal with those who have a propensity to wander and make sure that they don't wander away and get themselves into any difficulty. And so a higher level of support and care is provided in that section. Again, much like this last one, it's a spectrum of services that are being provided here. I asked about the bachelor units because I'm curious to know what rent is being assigned to the bachelor units, and although we said we would accept the rents, I did say I wanted to understand the allocation. The assessor doesn't know, so it's a blended rate that's been extracted in some way. 2018, the vacancy was allowed at 5%. I'm told vacancy in 16 was 4.7, and 17 was 3.1, we're using 3%. The expenses, again, you've got the same calculation from me at tab 3, where again, my source has been the questionnaire. I've gone through the questionnaire. The management is 5% of the effective gross income, and it brings us to 48.48. Sorry, 48.58 or 52%, and ultimately we're stabilizing at 46%. And Mr. Diamond, you'd asked in an earlier matter about the possibility that perhaps.
Same answer this time.
But,
Yeah.
you know, I'm being conservative, somewhat more than the assessor, but I'm being conservative. My comments on cap rate will be exactly the same as they were before. There's no kitchens. Anybody buying this place is buying it for purposes of running a business. It's a completely different level of risk. And then if you go to tab 5, you can see that I've used the assessor's average. I had it at $921 a unit. I've done that with the 3%, with the 46%, with a 5.75 cap rate, which brings me to $18,927,000, to which you would have to add $135,000 for the house, which we don't contest.
Okay.
And so that's what I'm proposing to you in terms of this one.
I have no questions.
Oh, thank you.
I'm sorry.
That's fine. Mr. Mayor, do you have any questions?
I have none, Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Luca, do you have any questions?
Just one. So you did inspect this property,
Oh, yes.
okay? And you were in the, I'm going to use the term lockdown facility. And you inspected that area.
And they're
And you would
doing,
agree that there's 24-hour care there?
absolutely. There's, and whether you call it care, support, there's people around, absolutely.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you. That's all my questions.
I don't have any questions, thank you. So, next is item number 4 on the agenda. And we're now dealing with 50 Ridgecrest Avenue. And when you're ready, Mr. Warren.
The subject property is 50 Ridgecrest. Roll number is 050-093-751-00. It's a residential apartment block that's 6 stories high. It was built in 2012 and has 173 suites with 46 outdoor parking stalls. On page 3 is our income valuation summary. We use average rents of $905 to get a potential income of $1,878,000. Use a 3% vacancy to get an effective gross income of $1,822,000. We use a 43% expense ratio to get a net operating income of $1,036,000. Capped at 5%, we have an estimated market value of $20,720,000, which is approximately $119,000 per unit. On page 4 are rent comparables. The rents that the model that utilized is lower than the average rent. On the bottom of page 4 are some expense comparables. The expenses at 43% are a little bit higher than what is typical of a newer building. On page 5 is information on how we derived our cap rates. On page 6 are some cap rate sales. And 333 Ward being the most comparable. On page 8 is a picture of the subject property with its location. On page 9 is some information on the property and its services. Page 11 to 13 are the income and expenses submitted by the owner. Once again, on page 14 are the market rents from CMHC, $725 per. The subject has 1 and 2 bedrooms. CMHC is indicating market rents to be about $11.91 for a 1-bedroom and $13.92 for a 2-bedroom for a newer property. The model rate at $905 is lower than average. On page 15 is the permit that was taken out for the property in 2011. Project value is about $18 million. The market has increased significantly from 2001 or 2011 to 2018. So I believe that the construction value supports the assessed value at $20,721,000. And I ask that you maintain the assessed value at $20,721,000.
Thank you. Mr. Newman, any questions?
I'm just curious, the average rent on this one is $905, page 4, $905 a unit. Is the model kicking out that number?
Yes.
How does the model do that?
Do what?
How does the model make an adjustment, looking at your comparables, how
Yeah.
does the model make an adjustment to $905?
It's typically based off of, I would say primarily the size of a building.
Right?
Yeah. So basically, if it's, whether they're kind of, I guess that's how it extracts the rent, because bigger buildings would typically have bigger, say maybe more 2 bedrooms.
Yeah. I'm just curious, because we're not contesting the rent on this
No, I
one.
understand.
But I'm just curious how the model does this, because I can't fathom how the model can do this.
Perhaps
Yeah,
that's why
what-
you're here.
Well, it takes all the income and expense information
Yeah.
that we collect from the property owners, and it applies it to all the attributes of the building, and it estimates a rent that way.
But look at your comps. How do your comps get to 905? I don't get it. And again, it doesn't matter,
Well,
but I don't get it.
Well, the thing is, there is a range, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and so the model has estimated a rent that's at lower than average range.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, you can't apply one rent to every single property.
I agree.
Yeah.
So does the model calculate rents on a per square foot basis?
I think that it takes it into, I don't know for sure, but I'm pretty sure it takes that into consideration.
Okay, so, I don't have any questions.
That's fine. Mr. Mayor, any questions?
Mr. Wong, can you tell us how big the 1-bedroom units are?
No,
No?
I don't know.
And you can't tell us either about the 2-bedroom?
No.
Okay. And you don't know whether they go up per floor? You would probably assume they do.
I'm,
And is there a difference between those that front the street and those that back onto the river?
I don't know. Yeah.
Okay.
it's 152,757 square feet.
All right. I have no other questions, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Miller, any questions?
Just one question, did you inspect the property?
No.
Okay, that's it, thank you.
I don't have any questions. Mr. Miller?
Actually, you know what? I did see this one. I apologize. I did inspect this property.
Again, I have no questions.
So, Mr. Mayor, to answer your question about the size of the units, 115 of the one-bedroom units are less than 600 square feet. 35 of the one-bedroom units are between 600 and 700 square feet. Overall, they average about 625 square feet. There actually are a number, the two bedrooms are a little bit larger. They average just over 1,000 square feet. So again, no kitchens, no dishwashers, no stoves. We're accepting the rent as it is. The vacancy's been set at 3%. Page 4 of my brief speaks about the fact that this property actually had some issues in terms of ramping up. It opened in 2012. It got full for a little bit, but only because there was a flood in another personal care type facility, and the residents got relocated. More recently, vacancies 9.1% and 3.8%. We've selected 4%. The expenses, again, same type of workup. Tab 3. 48.33% in 16, 50.8% in 17. Again, I've used 46%. Capitalization rate information is all the same, and it leads us to a calculation of value at tab 5 using the assessor's gross potential income, a 4% vacancy, 46% expenses, and a 5.75 cap to $16,938,000. Subject to questions, those are my submissions.
Any questions, Mr. Wong?
No questions.
Ms. Winkler, any questions for the applicant?
You inspected this property?
Yes?
Would you say it's the same quality as other properties of this nature that you've inspected?
So, my group of clients, if you will, is actually everything that's on the docket today in terms of these types of properties. The all seniors ones are all built to what I'm gonna call the same standard, except with the passage of time, there have been some variations within them. This one has the added attribute, if I can call it that, of being located along the river. And so it's got that benefit that the others don't. That makes it different, certainly from that perspective. But otherwise, I would say to you that they are all built to the same quality. But again, you talked about the facility at Shaftesbury. There's another one of those at 2701 Scotia, which is on this docket as well and is adjacent. And it's quite, but just by coincidence, there was a feature on the national news the other day that what they do to try and help the people in these facilities is they sort of paint the walls. There's doors there, but you won't think they're doors because they're painted as a library shelf, for example. And I've seen that in the Scotia facility. And this is, again, to make the residents comfortable and try and diminish their wandering tendencies. So clearly they're very, the client is very sophisticated in terms of things like that. But at the end of the day, it's like the other ones in a general sense, but again, some are a little newer, so just a little bit different.
Right. I'm sorry then, is the Ridgecrest property also an all seniors?
Yes. Everything on this docket that's independent living is all seniors with the exception of 1778 Pembina. And even in respect to that one, they actually manage it.
Okay, thank you. That's all my questions.
I don't have any questions.
Mr. Chairman, I have a couple questions.
Right?
Mr. Newman, I forgot to ask you on the previous one on Shaftesbury, is that at the municipal board too? Do you know, offhand?
I'm gonna say yes.
Okay,
I'm gonna say we ended up appealing all of them
okay,
on a protective basis.
okay. So,
I don't think you appealed this one.
You think not?
I don't think so.
Okay.
this one? This one
Shaftesbury
the-
or
Or
this-
Shaftesbury?
Shaftesbury.
Yeah,
Shaftesbury? No?
okay.
I just. Okay. So, Mr. Newman, you've increased, the city's at 3% vacancy rate, and you've got up by just one, so you're at 4.
Yes.
Okay. So, the expense ratio, 46%, you feel like is in line?
I tried to be, I'm gonna use the phrase reasonably conservative, in the sense that I did the analysis. The analysis showed us in the 48 to 50% range. I think the assessor's light. Mr. Diamond made the point earlier that there may be some, I'll use the word leakage of non-property related expenses into some of these items. And I've had this raised before in prior cycles, so I was conservative in picking my expense ratio.
And you feel like the cap rate should be 5 3/4?
Yes.
Okay. And is this property at the municipal board? Was it appealed before, or?
I
No.
think Mr. Wong knows.
Okay.
Yeah, it wasn't appealed in 2018 or 16.
Okay, I thank you. That's all the questions, Mr. Chairman, thank you.
My apologies, actually, it was appealed in 2018, but not 2016. My apologies.
Okay. Thank you, and I don't have any questions, so we can proceed now with our next property, which is at 1015 St. Anne's Road.
Will you applying the rebuttal brief
To all of them.
All of them.
Okay,
Yeah.
I need copies for each file.
Well, that's why when I handed out the,
I used those ones already.
okay, and I'll get you some more.
Okay, I can grab two.
I give you
from the
mine.
panel members.
I give you mine because I know what it
Yeah.
is here.
Okay.
That would do for one.
Yep. I'll
I'll
get you
need
some
a
more.
couple more.
Okay.
That's good.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay, so now we're dealing with 1015 St. Anne's Road. And Mr. Wong, when you're ready, you can proceed.
Subject property is 1015 St. Anne's Road. The roll number is 080-211-35800. It's a residential apartment block. It's 4 stories high. It was built in 2009 and has 168 suites with 8 indoor parking stalls and 70 outdoor parking stalls. On page 3 is our income valuation summary. We use average rents of $925 to get a potential income of $1,864,000. We use the 2.6% vacancy to get an effective gross income of $1,816,000. And we use the 43% expense ratio to get a net operating income of $1,032,000. Kept at 5%, we have an estimated market value of $20,652,000, which would go at $122,000 per unit. On page 4 are our rent comparables, showing that the rent that we've used is supported by the market. It's a little bit lower than average. On the bottom page 4 are some expense comparables, showing that the expenses that we used are in line. On page 5 is information on how we derived our cap rates. On page 6 are some cap rate sales. Again, 333 awards the most similar. On page 8 is a picture of the subject property. On page 9 is some information on the property, on the services provided. Page 11 to 13 are the income and expenses submitted by the owner. And on page 14 are market rents, which are higher than what the model has used. utilized. And page 15 is the permit that was taken out, the project value of $17 million in 2008. So the rents and the expenses and the cap rate are supported by market, and I ask that you maintain the assessed value at $20,652,000.
Thank you. Mr. Newman, any questions on this particular property that you're gonna ask some others?
You've said a couple of times now that 333 Ward is the most similar.
Yes.
Correct? And what's the most similar about it? Its age?
Yes.
So I'm just looking at a website for 333 Ward, Kenwood Court. Those units have in-suite laundry?
If you say so.
Okay. Well, we're all relying on what the website says, so.
There you go. It's also similar in the sense that it is an investment grade type property.
Sure.
It is larger.
Okay. But all the units there have kitchens, of course,
Yes.
and stoves and dishwashers and that type of thing. Okay. These buildings were built for purposes of operation as part of a going concern business, correct?
I would say so.
Yes. And I ask that in the context of your repeated reference on all of these properties to the permits and the permit cost. They weren't built to be operated as traditional apartments, they were built to be part of a larger business enterprise, correct?
I'm not sure. That's what it cost them to build it.
All right, those are my questions, thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Miller, any questions of the assessor?
Yes, once again, did you have a chance to inspect this property?
No.
Thank you, that's all my questions.
Mr. Merritt, any questions?
I have none, Mr. Chairman.
And I don't either.
Okay,
Mr. Newman.
so again, like the other ones, we're accepting the rent in this case. On vacancy, we're accepting the vacancy in this case as well. Level of expenses, look at tab 3 of my materials. Again, you've got the same calculation of expenses. You can see that expenses were 43.43, 44.82 in the 2 years. I've stabilized expenses at 44%, the midpoint. Capitalization rate, you've got the same presentation. And what that leads to in tab 5 is calculation of value utilizing the assessor's rents, the 2.6% vacancy, the 44% expense ratio, and a capitalization rate of 5.75%, which results in the value of $17,689,000. Subject to questions, those are my submissions.
Any questions, Mr. Moore?
No questions.
Mr. Merritt?
Mr. Newman, you just went up a touch in regards to expenses?
Yeah.
It's just rounding, or?
I took the midpoint essentially.
Okay. Okay. And again, the 5.75, you feel like that should be the appropriate cap rate?
I do, and I'm gonna make a submission at the end on all of them, but you heard a little preview of it in my opening remarks.
Is this at the municipal board at all? You know?
No.
No. Mr. Chairman, I think that's all the questions I have. Thank you.
Thank you. So, Mr. Newman, I'm looking at your tab number 3. Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, I absolutely can, I'm sorry. Ms. Linkletter, I'm sure it's not the same question I was going to ask you before.
Mr. Newman, I'm assuming you had a chance to visit this property.
I have, not for a while, I must confess, but I was in all of them.
Sorry, just under your vacancy,
Yep.
on page 5 of your brief, in 2018 it was 5%.
That's what the assessor used.
Right.
Yes.
And you're now using 2.6?
I've accepted the 2.6.
Do you know why the vacancy was at 5 previously?
I believe that these properties saw, in a general sense, a bit of an increase in their vacancy. I think it was a function of a lot of development of these types of facilities coming into the market. And as often the case, the demand was not exceeding the supply.
So that in turn would support your cap rate of 5.75.
The additional supply, yes.
Right.
Yep.
Okay, that's all my questions, thank you.
Okay, so Mr. Newman, I'm just looking at, again, your expenses on tab number 3.
Yep.
And I noticed the advertising.
Yep.
Seems to be a nice round number for both years. How did that happen?
So if you turn the page to page 2, you'll see in the middle column, the last item in that first grouping of general administration, $258,000. You probably
So
see.
who are you referring to, I guess?
So tab 3,
Page 2.
the second page
Yes.
in, the middle column, annual expenses. The fifth item down is marketing advertising,
Right.
$258,000. Now, you've probably seen on TV,
Okay.
you've probably seen on TV the ads they run with these lovely parent-like for me, grandparent-like for my children, residents, I think, who tout the virtues of these places. But that tells you two things. The advertising is constant, and there's significant advertising in the newspaper as well, which speaks to the competition level and the need to do this, to keep these places full. But at the same time, when I looked at it, I said to myself, this is a lot of advertising, a lot of which is directed, at least in part, towards what I'm gonna call the business service aspects of the facility, and I just felt it was too much to put in, so I stabilized it downward significantly. And you'll see the same thing in all the prior years as well.
Okay.
I've done the same type of thing.
So it's mostly contracted advertising,
Yeah,
and I guess they have a budget for each of the properties then,
Yeah.
and they spend the budget.
yeah.
Okay, thank you. That's my questions. So next property is at 2701 Scotia Street. And again, when you're ready, Mr. Wong.
The subject property is 2701 Scotia. The roll number is 05094246115. It's a residential apartment block that's 4 stories high. It was built in 2015. And it has 180 units with 92 outdoor parking stalls. On page 3 is our income valuation summary. We use average rents of $920 to get a potential income of $1,987,000. We used a 25% vacancy to get an effective gross income of $1,490,000. And we used a 43% expense ratio to get a net operating income of $847,000. Capped at 5%, we have an estimated market value of $16,945,000, approximately $94,000 per unit. On page 4 are our rent comparables, showing that the rents we use are in line with what's on the market, or it's lower than average. And on the bottom of page 4 are some expense comparables for some newer buildings, showing that the 43% that the model has utilized is a little bit higher than the average. Page 5 is information on how we derive our cap rates. On page 6 are some cap rate sales. On page 8 is a picture of the subject property. Page 9 is some information on the subject property. Page 10 are some interior pictures. Page 11 are the income and expenses submitted by the owner. Page 15 is the permit that was taken out. Their total project value is $22 million. And the rents and the expenses that we've used and the cap rate are supported by the market. And the permit value also supports the assessed value, and I asked that we maintain the value at $17,962,000.
Thank you. Mr. Neiman, any questions?
Mr. Wong, page 4. Left-hand column is the workup for the apartment. Right-hand column, headed cost property, is an adjustment, which I believe is for land value.
Yes?
But there's no information in your brief in relation to land values that I can see.
I'm not sure what the adjustment is for.
It must be the difference between page number 1, where you show the assessed value of $17,962, and your
Yeah.
workup, which shows it only $16,946.
Yeah.
I'm assuming the difference must be excess land value, I'm assuming.
Yeah. I
think
think
that
that's
says
what,
Mr. Neiman?
the note is indicated excess land value.
I'm just wondering. Because I noticed there was a discrepancy, I just didn't know why, I was gonna ask that
Yeah.
question.
That's my best guess.
Yeah,
Hence I asked the question.
but that's an assumption. Yeah, Mike.
I don't have a ton of information other than that it does appear to be a excess land value adjustment.
Okay. Those are my questions.
Mr. Mayor, any questions?
Yeah, so, Mr. Wong, what do we take the assessment? Is it 17 or is it 16?
I would take it to be 17,962.
So you can't tell us where the $1 million is?
Oh, I think it's over the allowed,
That is,
No, I think this is actually an important thing, because it is $1 million of assessment.
Yes.
I'm wondering if we should adjourn for a few minutes and let you go and check at the back at the city assessment department, because we're talking about $1 million here.
yes,
In the meantime, I can go and fill my meter up, which
Yes.
I'm gonna need another hour.
sure, yeah,
yeah,
And
okay.
I think we should have an answer for that.
yeah,
Yeah. Because it is,
I think I can help a little bit in this regard.
sure.
If you want to be
could.
helpful, we don't have to adjourn, I'm happy to do that.
Yes.
Okay?
So I know from the past that the assessor has indicated that there's 70,000 square feet of excess land. And, you know, Mr. Merritt, you will say to me, where is it? And if you look at page 8 in the assessor's brief, the overhead photo, I think it's gonna kind of jump out at you.
Yeah.
So I know this from the past. And I think when you do the math, it comes to $14.51 a square foot.
so on the page 8, the previous one, because they're both related, so Rivercrest is, if you look at the picture, is that to the right then? That's the property? I think it is.
Yes.
Okay, so.
So to the right is 50 Ridgecrest, and this one is 2701 Scotia.
Yeah, okay. So, in the blue, that's the excess land. You know,
Yeah, that open field.
Okay.
The open field.
okay. So we-
Where the roll number appears.
oh, okay, so we can take it as 17.9
Yes,
in total. Okay.
thank you.
Any other questions, Mr. Mayor?
Yes, I think I do here. Okay, so it is 17. Yes, I just noticed, I guess, no, I'm just looking at number 50. They're related, they're both the same companies, and, but I guess you cranked out a price per suite for the previous one, which was 120, say 120, 123, and this one comes to 94,000, but per suite, but that's gonna change because of the $1 million, eh?
That would be bumped up a little bit, yes.
Yeah.
Um,
So, in looking at the picture, this one, backs onto the river too, does it not? But not totally?
Correct.
Okay. But
It has a walkway, it appears to have a walkway
Yeah.
front from the river.
I just noticed, I guess, in the picture that, on page 10, that the previous property is, I guess, further down the way. This is the subject property, is it not?
Yeah,
Let's
actually,
go
if
check.
you look on the bottom right picture, the building on the far right is
Yeah.
50 Ridgecrest.
Okay. Okay. So I can figure out the price per unit.
It's 100,000 or 99.
100,000?
99,000.
99? I have no further questions, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Bennett, any questions?
Couple. Did you have a chance to inspect this property?
No, I did not.
Okay. So on page 10 of your brief, third picture down on the left, there's a picture of sort of a kitchen area.
Yep.
Is that a picture of what is in the suites?
I think there's some that have a fuller kitchen, and there's some that have park kitchens or without stoves.
Okay. And is that a guess on your part because you didn't inspect the property?
Well, I'm looking at the pictures. There's a,
No, I know, but that could be one of the common areas. That's not necessarily an apartment.
I'm not going to, I guess, make any assertions as to what it is, but these pictures are from their website.
But you don't know how many of these suites have actual kitchens?
No, I don't know.
That's all my questions.
Okay, and my questions have already been asked, so I was looking at those pictures too. If we look like a kitchen, and if it is in a unit, then I would think these are regular apartments. But Mr. Negro will probably clarify that for us, so we'll have to do that since you can't. Okay, Mr. Newman, the evidence is you to give now.
I'll start there.
Okay,
I have been there.
right.
There are 3 units that have a kitchen, and my brief speaks to this.
Okay.
And again, as I indicated earlier, with the passage of time, this is their newest facility, with the passage of time, there's an evolution in terms of the things they do. And again, frankly, they've had to broaden their, the types of programming they provide and types of services they offer because of the competition that is there. So, like the others, we have accepted the rent. It doesn't change my fundamental position in terms of this property. I will mention that there's a 25% vacancy with this property, which it's been slow to ramp up. They've had issues getting occupants, but we're accepting the 25% vacancy. It's higher at this point in time. Expenses, we don't have operating history for me to do the same analysis I did on the other properties. And so I've used 46%, which was the most common operating expense ratio on the other properties. The capitalization rate, you'll get the same information from me as you did on the others, but I do want to speak to the land value a little bit. So if you look at tab 4, tab 4 is a decision of this board in relation to an adjacent piece of land. And so there's the 2 pages of the decision, and then there's the brief that the assessor filed in relation to that property. And if you go to what is the 3rd page of that brief, you're going to see some overhead photos. And in those overhead photos, you can see a reference to rule number 500-942-4610. That was an additional parcel of land that was separately valued as vacant land. And the assessor came forward with that parcel with a set of comparables. And there was a hearing, and the comparables are listed on page 5. And the comparables ranged in value from $13.42 a square foot down to $13.62 a square foot. And the decision of the board fixed a value of $1,674,000, which based on the square footage that was an issue in that property $128,732. That came to $13 a square foot. And if I were to apply the $13 a square foot to the 70,000 square feet we're dealing with here, that would come to $910,000. And all of this is written on the last page of the text of my brief, immediately before tab 1. At the top section of the page, there's some discussion about land value. But I need to tell you one other thing about that. There is a development agreement which accompanies this property. And if you look at the overhead photo, which the assessor has at page 8 of his brief, you'll see that, you'll see Scotia Street. You'll see that it's listed there. And there's the yellow strip for Scotia Street, and there's a cul-de-sac sort of at the end, and then it ends. And there's a gap between what I'll call the cul-de-sac, and as you head further south, the existing Scotia Street. I believe there's about 118 meters in there, and pursuant to the development agreement, my client is obligated to pay for the installation of the street when the time comes. The time hasn't come yet, but they have that obligation, and so there's additional liability that flows with it. I'd like to say to you, I know exactly how much that's going to cost them, but I don't, because of course it's not going to happen until it needs to happen. But they have to put in 118 meters of street, and of course, there's a cost to that. So I would suggest to you that that further devalues the land further. As I said earlier, I can't give you a precise number because I don't know. But clearly, the evidence I'm providing in respect of the land is more comprehensive than the assessor's evidence. So I'm going to suggest to you that based on my tab 5, that reflected a value of $13,996,000. Something would have to be added to that on account of the land value. And my suggestion would be that an amount in the range of $500,000 to $750,000 be added to that, and that's going to put the value somewhere in the range of, let's call it $14,500,000 to $14,750,000, and that's what I'm proposing you should do in terms of value on this property. Thank you.
Thank you. Questions, Mr. Wong?
So I guess you've provided some information suggesting that the land value might be $910,000, which is $13 a square foot.
Yes, maximum.
Yeah, and you're suggesting that it should be less because there are other development costs?
Yes.
Okay. I guess my experience with, I guess, land sales is that
You have questions right now.
Oh, sorry.
Okay.
Sorry. So your suggested value of $500,000 to $750,000 is a very rough estimate based off of certain assumptions?
The starting point is the $13, which brings it down to $910.
Yep.
And then I'm taking off additional amounts, rough, I acknowledge,
Yep.
to account for the cost of putting the roadway in.
Okay, that's all my questions.
Thank you. Ms. Booth, are there any questions of the applicant?
No questions.
And Mr. Mayor, do you have any questions?
Just one. Mr. Newman, I didn't quite follow the exact end of what we were talking about. Now, there's one roll number for 2701 Scotia?
Yes.
And is there another roll number for the excess land?
No,
No.
it's on the same roll.
It's on the same roll?
Yeah, so
Okay.
if you look at page 8,
Okay.
that roll number that you see there is actually sitting,
Okay.
I'll call it in the excess land
Okay.
area.
Okay, so in your evaluation, in your presentation, you never had the other land or do you?
I do.
Oh, you
So
do.
what I did is I pointed, so to the, in the photo,
Yeah,
sort of to the left, you see Scotia Street.
yeah,
On the other side of Scotia Street is a different parcel of land, which is vacant land only, which was the subject of an appeal.
okay,
And that's the appeal that reduced the value of that land to $13 a square foot. And so that's the
Okay.
starting point for my view of the value of the excess land. The assessor's at $1,016,000. I'm saying it should be no more than $910,000, 70,000 square feet at $13 a square foot, with the $13 extracted from the decision on the unrelated across Scotia piece of land. And then I make an adjustment for that, for the development obligation to complete Scotia.
but you didn't add it to
I
your
agree.
figure here.
I agree, it's not
Okay.
added. So if you look at the very last page of the text of my brief,
Yeah,
final value, it says,
okay,
calculation of 13,996, to which must be added land value not to exceed 910. The board will be asked to fix a lesser value based on lesser land value.
where does it say
That's
that?
the very, right before tab one.
Oh, right before tab one,
Last
okay,
page before
Okay.
tab one.
okay. I always look at the very back.
I understand.
Okay. Okay, final. Okay. Okay, good. But you had mentioned also, that, is it the 910 less,
Cost of completing Scotia.
okay.
So in order to
you said-
develop this land,
Yeah,
there's an obligation under a development agreement with the city of Winnipeg, which I've reviewed, which says the developer, the owner, all seniors, has to pay to put in that road.
okay, okay. So you're coming down to between 500 to 700?
Right.
Okay, yeah, okay. Thank you.
Thank you, and I don't have any questions. Now, I do have to have a little adjournment
Yeah.
because I have to come up my meter.
Yeah.
Reconvening, and we're next gonna hear the property at 707 Center Street. Mr. Juan, give us through your brief when you're ready.
The subject property is 707 Center. It's a residential apartment building that's 4 stories high. It was built in 2007 and has 153 suites with 51 outdoor parking stalls. On page 3 is our income valuation summary. We use average rents of $875 to get a potential income of $1,606,000. We use a 2.6% vacancy to get an effective gross income of $1,564,000. And we use a 43% expense ratio to get a net operating income of $889,000. Capped at 5%, we have an estimated market value of $17,791,000, approximately $116,000 per unit. On page 4 are our rent comparables. And the rents we've used are supported by the market and is a little bit lower than average. And on the bottom are some expense comparables. Showing that the 43% that we use is a little bit higher than average. On page 5 is information on how we derived our cap rates. On page 6 are some cap rate sales. Page 8 is the overview picture of the subject property. Page 9 is some information on the property. It is an independent and assisted living property. Page 11 and 13 are the income and expenses submitted by the owner. Page 14 are market rents from CMHC. The subject is comprised of 1 and 2 bedrooms. CMHC is indicating $11.91 for 1 bedrooms and $13.92 for 2 bedrooms. So the $875 that we've used is lower than average. On page 15 is the permit for the work that was done in 2006. There's a declared project value of $9,500,000. The market value, the market has increased 2- and 3-fold in that time frame, and I believe that it's in line with the assessed value at $17,791,000. I ask that you maintain the assessed value at $17,791,000.
Thank you. Mr. Newman,
No questions.
any questions? Ms. McClure, do you have any questions of the assessor?
Once again, Mr. Wong, did you have a chance to inspect this property?
No.
On page 4 of your brief, all your rent comparables again are regular apartments.
Correct. You're valuing it as such.
Right. So would you agree that anybody can rent an apartment?
Sure.
Would you agree that anybody could move into this facility?
I'm not sure what the requirements are for moving in.
Are you aware that there's age requirements?
No.
That's all my questions, thank you.
Mr. Mayor, any questions?
I have none, Mr. Chairman.
And I don't either.
So, we've accepted the assessor's rent on this property. In terms of vacancy, the assessor's at 2.6%. 2017 vacancy on this property was 4.8%. We're utilizing 4%. Level of expenses, tab 3, is a similar calculation to what you've seen on the other properties. Comes to 47.42 and 49.11. We've selected 46%. Tab 5 is our calculation of value, using the assessor's rents, 4% vacancy, 46% expense ratio, and a 5.75% cap, brings us to $14,483,000. Subject to questions, that's my submission.
Mr. Wong, any questions?
No questions.
Mr. Merritt, any questions on this one?
I have none, Mr. Chairman.
And Ms. Lilly, do you have any questions?
Just one, Mr. Newman, did you inspect the property?
I have.
Thank you. That's all my questions.
Okay, and Mr. Newman, I guess the question is, of course, all of them, but I didn't ask you all of them, but again, there's no kitchens here,
No kitchens.
so it's basically an apartment without kitchen facilities.
Yes.
So it's basically,
And I want to go a step
Yeah.
further. And I want to make the observation that there are some independent living facilities that are capable of being used as traditional apartments. So that if for whatever reason, the market becomes oversaturated, the government outlaws facilities of this type, they can be used and converted as what I'll call traditional, typical apartments.
and then have a cap rate attributable to other like buildings.
These can't.
Yeah.
And I know, for example, that Mr. Story represents the artist people, and they've got facilities on Paget, out in Linden Woods, and I know that those are set up as traditional apartments. They can be sold as condos, they can be occupied as traditional apartments. Here, the wiring isn't there for a stove, for example. It's just not there, because they weren't built this way. It's a different business model, so.
Okay. And the apartments themselves are they big enough to be converted at an expense?
So the average size of the one bedrooms is 525 square feet. Let me tell you that when I started doing these,
Yep.
I got the plans, I got the breakdown of the units, that's why I know this information. The two bedrooms, the average is approximately 800 square feet. So, 525 square feet for a one bedroom compared to traditional sized apartments, is a little bit small. It's on the smaller side for a one-bedroom. You know, the older stock of apartment buildings, typically one-bedrooms were in the 600, 650 square foot range. So these are a little small. And again, as I said earlier, their configuration is such that they put a lot of area into the hallway, a lot of area into the washroom for mobility-related issues,
Right.
which is atypical of apartment buildings. So they're going to be, even if they could be modified and used, they would be less attractive because of where the space is.
Or the cost of rectifying it would be so significant, yes. Yeah. Okay, thank you. No further questions. So I believe that completes our docket today. And, well, no deliberating, you heard from us.
I'd like a brief submission, if I
If
might.
you want to make one, you can.
Yeah. So, and I think I probably said all of this, but I just want to tie it all together. So what the assessor has done, and he said it at the outset when we were dealing with 1778, they value as an apartment building because there's no information to value as an independent living. I understand that. I don't quarrel with conceptually the approach. I quarrel with the detail of how it's implemented. So, as I've said to you, with the exception of 1778 Pembina, we've accepted the rents. Historically, we never accepted the rents that were being used, but they were much more reasonable on this go-around. Generally, we have moved the vacancy around a little bit, with the exception of the St. Anne's property. The expense ratios, we have moved up, and as I said to you, you see almost universally a 46% usage, and you see that that is lower than the actuals in place. And on the cap rate, we've gone universally to 5.75%. Why have we done that? We've done that because, and I see the assessor's information, and I see their cap rate information in which they say they think 333 Ward is the most comparable facility, and that gets a 5 cap, and the model gives all buildings 1975 and later, in terms of built, a 5 cap, so this one should get a 5 cap, because they're treating it as a typical apartment building. But it's not, of course, for all the reasons you've heard. When you think about what I call the dormitories at 1778 Pembina Highway, who's buying that? The only person who's buying it is buying it as part of a going concern. They're not buying it like a traditional apartment building. When we think about all of the all seniors properties, except for the 3 units at the Scotia property, none of them have kitchens. So that limits the use that can be made of them. It limits the market in terms of who will be prepared to occupy them. People typically aren't moving into a facility that doesn't have what I'll call a kitchen in some way. So I say to you that all the evidence points to a capitalization rate that has to be higher than is being applied to low-rise apartment buildings, and that's why I have requested the 5.75%. The assessors pointing to the permit values, I think that's completely irrelevant. We're not doing a cost valuation on these properties. These things were built and the cost was incurred as part of a going concern enterprise to be operated. So I think ultimately the cost is completely irrelevant. So I'm asking that ultimately you accept our values overall generally, and in particular the 5.75% capitalization rate.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Do you make a suggestion, Mr. Wong?
Sure. These independent living, assisted living type properties, if you were to value it like we're trying to value it like an apartment building, it would require a significant amount of adjustments. It's like you would need to have adjustments for the size of the unit, have adjustments for advertising, have adjustments for higher tenant turnover, have adjustments for the expenses, and having no kitchens. That's a lot of adjustments to have to make to try to come up with an estimate of value. the approach that we've taken is actually very similar to the approach that was suggested in the article that Mr. Newman presented, is to typically a comparable apartment building in terms of size, construction, condition is appropriate for estimating the economic rent. None of those comparable apartments are going to have, they're all going to have kitchens. And so when they make reference to using a comparable apartment to try to estimate the value of this type of property, I think they're just referring to regular apartments. And without the fact that you're using market level apartments, then you don't have to make the multitude of adjustments that that is potentially suggested. So having said that, we are trying to value them as apartments, and we're looking to the market to establish rents and expenses and cap rates. That's what we've done. We've gone to the market, we've reflected in all the properties that we have, we've reflected the income with lower than market income and say higher than market expenses. Newer properties typically are in the 38% range, and we were typically at about 43%. So in two areas, we used lower rents to try to estimate the value, and we use higher rate of expenses. The cap rate that we've used is supported by what's in the market. Like 333 Ward is a good example, and the thing is, the appraisal for 333 Ward used a 5% cap rate, and all the sales that went into establishing that cap rate indicated 5%. And so we've reflected this as lower than average apartment building in the operating income, and we've used a market level cap rate that is supported, and it's very real in the marketplace. And so having considered all those things, we believe that we've estimated the assessed value in a fair manner, and I ask that you accept the values that were presented today.
Thank you very much. If you have a response that is just, I'll let you make that.
There are a spectrum of people out in this world who buy apartment buildings as investments. They know the business, that's what they do.
You could have said this last time, though. This is not a direct response. That is something that.
It's indirect response.
No, because you were trying to differentiate these buildings from regular apartment buildings, and you have the opportunity. But we get that in the information.
Fair enough.
Okay.
Thank you.
Well, thank you both for your presentations. You were both very efficient and seemed to make this easier than it could have been.